The wind-sculpted cliffs of Dover rose white against the grey waters of the Channel in the late summer of 55 BC, when the first Roman galleys appeared on the horizon, their red sails marking the arrival of forces that would fundamentally transform the island that Greeks had called the Britannic Isles, and Romans would name Britannia. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down. Volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The Britain that confronted Roman ambitions in the mid-1st century BC existed as a patchwork of tribal kingdoms whose political organization, material culture, and economic systems had developed substantially since the Bronze Age collapse that had disrupted Mediterranean civilizations over a millennium earlier. The island's population, estimated at between 1 and 2 million inhabitants, concentrated primarily in the southern and eastern regions, where fertile soils supported agricultural communities that had mastered ironworking technologies and developed sophisticated craft production systems. The tribal confederations that dominated different regions of Britain maintained complex relationships involving warfare, trade, and shifting alliances that created a dynamic political landscape resistant to simple categorization or unified control. The Catuvellani, who controlled territories north of the Thames, the Trinovantes, occupying what would become Essex, the Atrebates in the south-central regions, and the Iceni in what would later be called East Anglia, represented only the most prominent of numerous tribal groups whose territories, leadership structures, and external relationships would profoundly influence how Roman conquest proceeded and how Romano-British society ultimately developed. Archaeological evidence from the century preceding Roman invasion reveals increasing continental influence on British material culture, particularly in the southeast, where cross-channel trade relationships had introduced Gallic pottery styles, coinage systems adapted from Roman models, and Mediterranean luxury goods, including wine, amphorae, and fine metalwork that appeared in elite burial contexts. These trade connections, facilitated by tribal leaders who recognized the economic advantages of continental relationships, created networks of commerce and cultural exchange that would later provide Rome with intelligence about British political conditions and potential collaborators who might support conquest efforts in exchange for political advantages within the new imperial system. Julius Caesar's decision to launch exploratory expeditions to Britain during his Gallic campaigns reflected multiple strategic calculations that combined immediate military objectives with longer-term political considerations. Related to his position within the complex power dynamics of late Republican Rome, the official justifications for British intervention, articulated in Caesar's own commentaries on the Gallic Wars, emphasized the military assistance that British tribes had provided to Gallic resistance movements and the potential threat that continued British independence posed to the stability of newly conquered Gallic territories. However, the expeditions also served Caesar's personal political objectives by demonstrating his military boldness through an attack on territories beyond the known world, generating prestigious military achievements that would enhance his reputation among Roman voters and provide compelling material for the propaganda campaigns that sustained his political career. The first expedition, launched in late August of 55 BC, involved approximately 10,000 infantry and cavalry transported across the Channel in 80 transport ships, accompanied by warships that provided protection against potential British naval interference. The fleet's departure from Portus Itius, probably modern Boulogne, occurred late enough in the campaigning season to suggest that Caesar conceived the expedition as a reconnaissance mission rather than a full-scale conquest attempt, gathering intelligence about British geography, political conditions, and military capabilities that might inform future operations. The expedition encountered immediate difficulties when Caesar's forces discovered that British warriors had assembled along the cliffs near the intended landing site. Their commanding position and demonstrated willingness to resist, forcing the Roman fleet to sail several miles along the coast, searching for beaches that could accommodate a contested amphibious landing. The landing that finally occurred near modern Deal involved chaotic fighting as Roman soldiers, burdened with heavy equipment and unfamiliar with amphibious warfare, struggled to reach shore, while British forces launched attacks from the shallow waters and beaches. Caesar's account emphasizes the decisive role of the 10th Legion's standard-bearer, who jumped into the water while shouting encouragement to his comrades, his actions shaming other soldiers into following and enabling the Romans to establish a precarious beachhead despite fierce British resistance. The military operations that followed the initial landing demonstrated both the tactical effectiveness of Roman military systems and the significant logistical vulnerabilities that limited Roman capability to project power into territories. Lacking the infrastructure and agricultural surplus that sustained campaigns in more developed regions, British forces, employing light infantry tactics and chariot warfare techniques unfamiliar to Roman commanders, accustomed to Mediterranean and Gallic combat methods, inflicted casualties through rapid strikes that exploited the Romans' limited cavalry strength and avoided the set-piece battles where Roman infantry superiority could prove decisive. The storm that destroyed a significant portion of Caesar's fleet shortly after the landing created a supply crisis that nearly forced the expedition's abandonment, as Roman soldiers found themselves cut off from reinforcements and resupply while operating in hostile territory without secure logistics lines. Caesar's success in extracting his forces from this dangerous situation reflected his tactical skill and the discipline of his veteran legions. But the expedition's limited achievements, confined largely to the immediate coastal area, with only brief incursions into the interior, hardly justified the risks involved or fulfilled the ambitious objectives that Caesar's propaganda had suggested. The second expedition, launched in July of 54 BC, with a substantially larger force of approximately 25,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, transported in over 800 ships, represented a more serious attempt at demonstrating Roman military dominance and establishing the political relationships that might facilitate future conquest. This expanded force enabled Caesar to advance inland beyond the Thames, engaging British forces commanded by Cassivellaunus, the leader of the Catuvellauni, whose defensive strategy emphasized mobile warfare and scorched earth tactics designed to exhaust Roman supplies and morale, without offering opportunities for the decisive battles that Roman military doctrine preferred. The campaign's climax involved Roman assault on Cassivellaunus's stronghold, probably located near modern Weethampstead in Hertfordshire, where earthwork fortifications demonstrated the sophisticated defensive engineering that British tribes had developed. The stronghold's capture, achieved through characteristic Roman siege warfare methods, forced Cassivellaunus to negotiate terms that included tribute payments and guarantees against attacks on Rome's Gallic allies, creating a nominal British submission that Caesar could present as a conquest to Roman audiences, despite the expedition's failure to establish permanent occupation or administrative control. The political and strategic significance of Caesar's British expeditions must be evaluated within the context of late Republican Roman politics, rather than assessed purely on their immediate military or territorial achievements. The expeditions generated enormous publicity in Rome, where Caesar's political agents, particularly his associate Cicero, whose brother Quintus accompanied the second expedition, promoted narratives emphasizing the daring and unprecedented nature of military operations beyond the ocean, the mythical boundary that Mediterranean peoples had long considered the limit of the habitable world. The practical results of the expeditions, including intelligence about British geography and political conditions, tribute agreements that nominally acknowledged Roman supremacy, and the establishment of diplomatic relationships with cooperative British leaders, would prove valuable for future conquest efforts, even though Caesar himself never returned to Britain. The civil wars that consumed Roman political energy for the next 2 decades eliminated any possibility of immediate follow-up to Caesar's initial interventions, allowing British tribes to develop independently while maintaining trade relationships with the Roman world that continued to influence British material culture and political development. The establishment of the Augustan Principate and the subsequent emphasis on consolidating existing frontiers rather than pursuing expansionist adventures meant that Britain remained outside direct Roman control for nearly a century after. Caesar's expeditions, though Roman diplomatic influence, continued to affect British political dynamics, as various tribal leaders sought Roman support for their local rivalries and power struggles. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals increasing Roman cultural influence in southeastern Britain, particularly in the territories controlled by the Catuvellauni, whose leaders adopted Romanized titles, struck coinage featuring Latin inscriptions and Roman imperial imagery, and imported Mediterranean luxury goods in quantities suggesting substantial elite investment in Roman material culture. The Catuvellauni expansion, under leaders like Tatiovanus and his son Cunobelinus, brought increasing territories under their control, including the conquest of the Trinovantes and the establishment of a new capital at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, whose development as an oppidum with substantial fortifications and evidence of craft specialization demonstrated the increasing sophistication of British political organization during the decades preceding Roman conquest. The decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Britain under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD reflected political calculations fundamentally different from those that had motivated Caesar's expeditions. As the new emperor sought military achievements that would legitimize his unexpected accession and demonstrate his capability to lead the empire's military forces. Claudius's position as emperor resulted from circumstances largely beyond his control, as the Praetorian Guard's selection of him, following Caligula's assassination, had elevated to supreme power, a man whom the Roman elite generally regarded as physically disabled, intellectually limited, and unsuited for imperial responsibilities. The conquest of Britain offered Claudius the opportunity to achieve the kind of dramatic military success that had been denied to Augustus and Tiberius, both of whom had considered British campaigns but ultimately focused their military resources elsewhere. The immediate pretext for invasion involved appeals from British tribal leaders, particularly Verica of the Atrebates, who had been driven from his kingdom by Catuvellauni expansion and sought Roman assistance in recovering his position. These appeals provided diplomatic justification for military intervention, while also ensuring that Roman forces would have local allies, whose knowledge of British political conditions and geographical features would prove invaluable during the conquest campaigns. The invasion force assembled for the operation represented one of the largest military concentrations deployed for a single campaign during the early imperial period, comprising 4 legions, totaling approximately 20,000 heavy infantry, plus equivalent numbers of auxiliary troops drawn from various provinces throughout the empire. The 2nd Legion, Augusta, 9th Legion Hispana, 14th Legion Gemina, and 20th Legion Valeria each brought their distinctive military traditions and combat experience to the campaign, creating a diverse force capable of adapting to the varied tactical challenges that British resistance would present. The logistical preparations necessary for launching and sustaining the invasion demonstrated the sophisticated administrative and organizational capabilities that enabled Rome to project military power across vast distances while maintaining supply lines that supported forces operating far from their bases. The assembly of transport shipping sufficient to move 40,000 soldiers, plus their equipment, horses, and supplies across the Channel required coordination between multiple provinces and the mobilization of merchant vessels from throughout the Western Empire. The invasion force concentrated at Gazoriacum, modern Boulogne, where the narrow channel crossing offered the shortest sea voyage, while facilities could accommodate the massive fleet required for the operation. The soldiers' initial reluctance to embark for an expedition beyond the known world, requiring intervention by Claudius's freedman Narcissus to restore discipline and morale, suggests that Britain's reputation as a remote and barbarous land created genuine fear even among experienced legionaries who had campaigned across the empire. The successful Channel crossing, apparently unopposed by British forces who may not have anticipated the invasion's timing or landing locations, enabled Roman troops to establish beachheads in southeastern Britain, from which they could begin the advance inland toward British tribal centres. The location of the initial landings remains disputed among modern scholars, with arguments supporting sites ranging from the traditional identification at Richborough in Kent to alternative theories suggesting multiple landing points along the Sussex coast. But the weight of archaeological evidence increasingly supports Richborough as at least one major landing site where substantial Roman military installations would later develop. The Roman advance inland proceeded through territories occupied by the Cantiaci, the tribal group controlling Kent, whose apparent failure to offer sustained resistance may reflect political calculations about the futility of opposing Roman military superiority or potential arrangements with Roman commanders that secured favorable terms for submission. The first major military engagement of the invasion occurred at a river crossing, probably the Medway, where British forces commanded by Caratacus and Togodumnus, sons of the deceased Cunobelinus, attempted to block Roman advance toward Camulodunum. The battle, lasting 2 days, according to Roman sources, demonstrated both the tactical skill of Roman commanders, who found a ford that enabled auxiliary units to outflank British positions, and the determined resistance that British forces could mount when led by capable commanders fighting in favourable terrain. Roman victory at the Medway opened the path to the Thames, where British resistance collapsed following Togodumnus's death in the fighting and the withdrawal of British forces to territories north and west of the river. The Roman advance halted at the Thames while awaiting Emperor Claudius's arrival from Rome, a delay that served obvious political purposes by ensuring that Claudius could personally lead the final advance to Camulodunum and claim credit for the conquest's decisive phase. Claudius's journey to Britain, undertaken with elaborate ceremony and accompanied by Praetorian cohorts and war elephants whose presence would intimidate British observers, lasted only 16 days in Britain itself, but achieved its objective of associating the emperor directly with military triumph. The formal submission of 11 British kings to Claudius at Camulodunum, whether genuine diplomatic achievements or theatrical performances for propaganda purposes, provided the symbolism necessary for Claudius to celebrate a triumph in Rome and establish his military credentials. The establishment of a colonia for veteran soldiers at Camulodunum, the first permanent Roman urban foundation in Britain, marked the beginning of the transformation process that would gradually convert British tribal territories into integrated components of the Roman provincial system. The military campaigns that followed Claudius's ceremonial conquest involved systematic expansion of Roman control through campaigns that combined military force with diplomacy aimed at securing the submission of British tribes, without requiring the resource-intensive warfare that prolonged resistance would demand. The Second Legion Augusta's campaign in the southwest, under the future Emperor Vespasian, involving the capture of over 20 oppida and the submission of 2 powerful tribes, according to Suetonius's later account, extended Roman control through territories that would become the civitates of the Durotriges and Dumnonii. Archaeological evidence from sites like Maiden Castle in Dorset reveals the violent character of these conquest campaigns, as excavations uncovered human remains showing traumatic injuries consistent with Roman military assault, including a skull with a ballista bolt embedded in the vertebrae. The fortified hill forts that characterized British settlement patterns in the southwest presented significant tactical challenges for Roman forces, requiring siege warfare techniques and the concentration of artillery and engineering resources that slowed the pace of advance, but ultimately proved incapable of withstanding Roman military technology and organization. The establishment of the Second Legion's fortress at Exeter by approximately 55 AD provided a permanent military base for controlling the southwest, while facilitating the gradual Romanization of tribal territories through the imposition of Roman administrative structures, and the introduction of Roman material culture. The 14th and 20th Legions' advance into the Midlands and Wales encountered different terrain and tactical challenges, as the hill country and forests of these regions favoured the defensive warfare and guerrilla tactics, at which British forces proved increasingly adept under leaders who recognised that avoiding set-piece battles while harassing Roman supply lines offered the best hope of resisting conquest. Caratacus's emergence as the focal point for British resistance, following his withdrawal from southeastern territories, demonstrated both the continued vitality of British military opposition and the limitations that tribal political structures imposed on coordinated resistance efforts. His campaigns in the Welsh borderlands between approximately 47 and 51 AD employed defensive strategies that maximized the advantages offered by difficult terrain, while attempting to inspire resistance among tribes that had not yet submitted to Roman authority. The Roman response to this sustained resistance involved both military campaigns designed to eliminate Caratacus's forces and diplomatic efforts aimed at isolating him from potential tribal allies, through arrangements that offered favorable terms to tribes willing to accept Roman supremacy. The frontier zone that developed along the line, roughly corresponding to the Fosse Way, connecting Exeter in the southwest to Lincoln in the northeast, represented the limit of secure Roman control during the initial conquest phase, with territories beyond this line remaining contested and requiring continued military operations to secure. The establishment of legionary fortresses at locations including Lincoln and Gloucester provided bases for operations beyond the initial conquest zone, while creating permanent military infrastructure that would shape the province's development for decades. Governor Publius Ostorius Scapula's campaigns against Caratacus intensified during the late 40s AD, involving systematic reduction of British strongholds and the construction of Roman military infrastructure designed to support sustained operations in difficult terrain. The final confrontation occurred in 51 AD, somewhere in the Welsh borderlands, where Caratacus had prepared defensive positions that exploited natural advantages, including a river barrier and elevated terrain, from which British forces could oppose Roman assault. The battle's outcome: a decisive Roman victory achieved through characteristic Roman tactical flexibility and the superior training that enabled legionaries to overcome natural obstacles and scale steep slopes under fire, eliminated organized British resistance in the region, though Caratacus himself escaped the battlefield, only to be betrayed by Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, whose alliance with Rome reflected political calculations that prioritized her own position over pan-British resistance to Roman conquest. The transfer of Caratacus to Rome, where he was paraded in Claudius's triumph but subsequently granted clemency, demonstrated Roman understanding of the propaganda value of defeated enemies, while illustrating the emperor's mercy, a calculated display of imperial clemency that served multiple political objectives within Roman domestic politics, while sending messages to British tribes about the futility of continued resistance. The decade following Caratacus's capture witnessed continued Roman military expansion into Wales and the north, campaigns interrupted but not fundamentally redirected by the political upheaval in Rome following Claudius's death in 54 AD and Nero's accession to imperial power. The new emperor's initial disinterest in British affairs, reflecting his preference for Greek culture and artistic pursuits over military concerns, meant that British governors operated with substantial autonomy in determining conquest strategies and administrative policies. Governor Aulus Didius Gallus, serving from approximately 52 to 57 AD, faced renewed British resistance, including an anti-Roman faction among the Brigantes, led by Venutius, who challenged his estranged wife Cartimandua's pro-Roman policies. Roman military intervention in support of Cartimandua, necessary to preserve the alliance relationship that secured the northern frontier, demonstrated the extent to which Roman control in Britain depended on maintaining the collaborative relationships with client rulers who governed territories beyond direct Roman administration. The appointment of Quintus Veranius as governor in 57 AD brought renewed aggressive campaigning, particularly against the Silures in southern Wales, whose fierce resistance had made them notorious among Roman commanders as particularly difficult opponents. Veranius's death after only a year in office brought Gaius Suetonius Paulinus to the governorship, an experienced commander whose previous campaigns in Mauritania had demonstrated his capability in mountain warfare and his willingness to employ the ruthless methods that conquest of determined resistance required. Suetonius Paulinus's decision to launch a campaign against Anglesey in 60 AD reflected strategic calculations about eliminating the center of Druidic power that Roman commanders believed coordinated and inspired British resistance to Roman rule. The Druids, serving as religious leaders, legal authorities, and cultural preservers for British tribes, represented an alternative source of authority that competed with Roman political and cultural influence while maintaining traditions that Romans viewed as barbaric, particularly the practice of human sacrifice that classical authors repeatedly emphasized in their accounts of Celtic religious practices. The military operation required crossing the Menai Strait, a tidal channel whose swift currents and the fierce resistance expected from defenders who recognized the existential threat to their religious center made the assault a significant tactical challenge. Roman sources describe the scene awaiting Paulinus's forces as they prepared to cross with British warriors assembled on the opposite shore accompanied by druids, uttering curses, and women dressed in black waving torches like furies, a tableau designed to unnerve attackers through psychological warfare that exploited Roman anxieties about alien religious practices. The successful Roman assault, achieved through a combination of amphibious landing and the superior discipline that enabled Roman soldiers to overcome their initial fear, resulted in the destruction of the sacred groves and the killing of druids, whose religious authority Romans viewed as incompatible with Roman rule. The campaign's apparent success in eliminating this center of resistance was immediately overshadowed by news reaching Paulinus of a massive rebellion that had erupted in his rear, threatening Roman control over the province's most developed regions and requiring immediate response that would test Roman military capability and political judgment. The Boudiccan revolt, erupting in 60 or 61 AD, represented the most serious threat to Roman control in Britain since the initial invasion, and revealed fundamental problems in how Roman administration had developed in the conquered territories. The revolt's origins lay in a combination of specific grievances related to Roman treatment of the Iceni royal family following King Prasutagus' death, and broader resentments about Roman administrative practices, economic exploitation, and cultural transformation imposed on tribes that had submitted to Roman authority. Prasutagus had maintained his kingdom as a client state under Roman supervision, a status that theoretically preserved his people's autonomy while acknowledging Roman supremacy. His will, attempting to preserve his family's position and his people's welfare, named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his daughters, a provision intended to secure Roman protection for his succession arrangements. Roman officials' response, involving the annexation of Iceni territories, the confiscation of tribal nobles' property, and, according to Tacitus's account, the flogging of Prasutagus' widow Boudica and the rape of his daughters, demonstrated the casual brutality that could characterize Roman provincial administration when restraining influences of effective imperial supervision were absent. The Iceni response, rallying warriors who had submitted their weapons following earlier Roman conquest but retained hidden arms for precisely such emergencies, demonstrated that tribal military capability had not been eliminated by nominal submission to Roman authority. The revolt's rapid expansion to include the Trinovantes and other southeastern tribes revealed the widespread resentment that Roman administrative practices had generated among peoples who had been among the first to submit to Roman conquest and had experienced most directly the transformation that Roman rule imposed. The Trinovantes' grievances centered particularly on the veterans' colonia established at Camulodunum, where Roman settlers had appropriated tribal lands, treated the native population with contempt, and constructed a massive temple to the deified Claudius, whose maintenance costs fell heavily on local communities. The temple, serving as a physical manifestation of Roman imperial cult and requiring expensive maintenance funded through local taxation, represented everything that made Roman rule oppressive to British tribes forced to finance religious observances honoring their conquerors. The colonists' failure to construct adequate fortifications around their settlement, reflecting overconfidence in Roman military superiority and underestimation of British military capability, left them vulnerable when revolt erupted and British forces converged on the colonia. The veteran settlers' desperate defense of the temple complex lasted only 2 days before being overwhelmed by attackers whose fury at years of accumulated grievances manifested in massacre and destruction that Tacitus describes in terms emphasizing the revolt's savagery. The destruction of Camulodunum sent shockwaves through Roman Britain as news of British victory spread through tribal networks, while Roman officials struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster and organize effective military response. The 9th Legion's attempt to relieve Camulodunum, advancing from their fortress at Lincoln, with a force probably numbering approximately 2,000 infantry, encountered British forces who ambushed and destroyed the Legion's infantry component, killing the legate's second in command and forcing the surviving cavalry to retreat to their fortress. This defeat eliminated the nearest Roman military force capable of immediate intervention, while demonstrating that British forces fighting under capable leadership could inflict serious casualties on Roman regulars when tactical conditions favored the defenders. Governor Suetonius Paulinus's response to the crisis demonstrated both the strategic mobility that Roman military organization enabled and the difficult command decisions that provincial governors faced when confronted with thousands. Emergencies requiring rapid action despite incomplete information. The governor's decision to advance rapidly with cavalry forces, while his infantry followed at their best pace, brought him to Londinium, probably within days of learning about the revolt, where he faced the decision whether to defend the growing commercial settlement or abandon it to save his forces for the decisive confrontation that would determine the province's fate. Londinium's importance as a commercial centre, hosting merchants from throughout the empire and serving as the de facto capital of the province, despite lacking official colonial status, made its abandonment a difficult decision that would expose thousands of Roman citizens and provincials to British vengeance. Paulinus's choice, prioritizing military necessity over sentiment and recognizing that his limited forces could not defend an unwalled commercial town against overwhelming numbers, resulted in the abandonment of Londinium and subsequently Verulamium to their fate. Archaeological evidence from both sites reveals the destruction that followed as British forces burned the settlements and massacred inhabitants who had been unable or unwilling to flee, leaving destruction layers that can still be identified in excavations over 19 centuries later. The death toll from the revolt, estimated by Tacitus at 70,000 Romans and allied Britons killed in Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, reflected the intensity of British fury at Roman rule and the determination to eliminate the Roman presence through systematic destruction of the settlement pattern and infrastructure that sustained colonial occupation. The decisive confrontation between Paulinus's reunited forces and the British army led by Boudicca occurred at an unidentified location somewhere in the Midlands, probably along Watling Street, where the Roman advance from Wales would have intersected with British movements from the southeast. Paulinus's selection of the battlefield demonstrated the tactical acumen that had made him a successful commander, as he positioned his approximately 10,000 heavy infantry and equivalent auxiliary forces on favourable ground where British numerical superiority would be offset by terrain advantages that limited British ability to exploit their numbers, while enabling Roman tactical systems to function effectively. The battle unfolded according to patterns familiar from Roman military doctrine, as disciplined infantry formations absorbed the initial British assault, then transitioned to offensive action that exploited superior training and equipment. The presence of British supply wagons and families arrayed behind the fighting line, whether positioned there by British confidence in victory or by practical necessity in an army that moved with its entire community, created obstacles that hindered retreat when Roman counterattack broke British formations and transformed organized combat into chaotic rout. The massacre that followed, with Roman troops killing indiscriminately among warriors and non-combatants alike, while the cavalry prevented escape, resulted in casualties that contemporary sources probably exaggerated in claiming 80,000 British dead versus only 400 Roman casualties, but which certainly represented catastrophic losses that broke the revolt's military capability and forced surviving British leaders, including Boudicca, to recognize defeat. Boudicca's death, attributed by Roman sources to self-administered poison taken to avoid capture, eliminated the symbolic leader around whom British resistance had coalesced, while her fate served Roman propaganda purposes by demonstrating the inevitable consequences of challenging imperial authority. The aftermath of the Boudiccan revolt brought both immediate military repression and eventual policy reforms that reflected Roman recognition that administrative practices had contributed to the crisis and required modification if the province was to achieve stable integration into the empire. Paulinus's initial response emphasized military punishment of tribes that had participated in or supported the revolt, with systematic campaigns designed to eliminate remaining resistance through methods that Tacitus suggests approached genocidal in their scope and brutality. The deployment of substantial military forces, including reinforcements brought from Germany to replace losses suffered during the revolt, enabled comprehensive military operations that reasserted Roman control while demonstrating imperial determination to maintain the province despite the enormous costs that suppression required. The eventual replacement of Paulinus as governor, decided in Rome, after reports reached the imperial court, suggesting that his harsh policies risked provoking renewed resistance or creating conditions that would require permanent military occupation, brought Publius Petronius Turpilianus to the position with instructions to pursue conciliatory policies aimed at reconciliation rather than continued punishment. The shift in approach reflected Roman pragmatism about provincial administration, recognizing that successful imperial rule required creating conditions that encouraged local elites to collaborate with Roman authority, while providing ordinary provincials with sufficient incentives to accept Roman rule despite its burdens and disruptions to traditional ways of life. The process of recovery in the devastated southeastern territories proceeded gradually through the 60s and 70s AD, as Roman administrators worked to rebuild destroyed urban centers, restore agricultural production, and reconstruct the administrative and commercial relationships that had begun developing during the initial 2 decades of Roman rule. The consolidation of Roman control over the southern lowlands during the generation following the Boudiccan revolt proceeded simultaneously with continued military expansion into Wales and the north, campaigns that extended Roman territorial control while developing the military infrastructure that would permanently shape the province's geography and settlement patterns. The completion of the conquest of Wales, under governors including Marcus Vettius Bolanus and Sextus Julius Frontinus during the 60s and 70s AD, involved systematic reduction of tribal territories through campaigns that combined military operations with diplomatic arrangements designed to secure submission without requiring the complete destruction of tribal societies. Frontinus's campaigns against the Cilias in the mid-70s AD finally accomplished what previous governors had attempted for nearly 3 decades, breaking the resistance of tribes whose determined defense of their territories had made them legendary among Roman soldiers. The establishment of legionary fortresses at Caerleon and Chester provided permanent military bases for controlling Wales, while supporting continued operations against tribes that remained unsubdued or threatened renewed resistance. The construction of extensive road networks connecting these fortresses with each other and with the Roman military infrastructure in the lowlands enabled rapid movement of forces while facilitating the commercial development and administrative integration that gradually transformed conquered territories into functioning components of the provincial system. The arrival of Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor in 77 AD brought to Britain one of the most capable commanders of the Flavian period, a man whose previous service in the province as a junior officer during the Boudiccan revolt and as a legionary legate during the early 70s AD gave him exceptional familiarity with British conditions and challenges. Agricola's initial campaigns completed the conquest of Wales and northern England, operations that his son-in-law Tacitus would later describe in idealized terms, emphasizing the governor's military skill, administrative wisdom, and cultural sophistication. The campaigns in northern England during Agricola's governorship brought Roman forces into contact with the Brigantes, whose vast territories covering much of what would become Yorkshire, Lancashire, and neighbouring regions made them Britain's largest tribal group, and whose internal political divisions created opportunities for Roman diplomatic and military intervention. The Brigantian leadership crisis that had developed during the 60s AD, pitting the pro-Roman queen Cartimandua against her estranged husband Venutius, who led an anti-Roman faction, had required previous Roman military intervention to maintain the client relationship through which Rome had secured the northern frontier. Venutius's eventual success in driving Cartimandua from power in approximately 69 AD, during the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, when civil war distracted Roman attention from frontier provinces, eliminated the client arrangement and required direct Roman military intervention to secure territories that had previously been controlled through diplomatic arrangements. Agricola's campaigns in the north systematically extended Roman control through Brigantian territories, establishing forts at strategic locations, including York, where the 9th Legion's fortress would become one of Roman Britain's most important military installations. The consolidation of control over northern England brought Roman power to the Tyne-Solway Isthmus, where geographical features created a natural boundary between the lowlands that Roman administration could effectively exploit and the Cuda, highlands beyond where terrain and limited agricultural surplus would make Roman occupation challenging to sustain. Agricola's decision to advance beyond this line into Scotland reflected both strategic considerations about eliminating potential threats to the secured frontier and personal ambitions to achieve the complete conquest of Britain that would enhance his reputation and satisfy his emperor's desire for military glory that could legitimize the Flavian dynasty's relatively recent acquisition of imperial power. The Scottish campaigns conducted during the later years of Agricola's governorship, between approximately 79 and 83 or 84 AD, extended Roman military operations into territories where climate, terrain, and limited agricultural development created conditions fundamentally different from those in the southern lowlands. The tribal groups occupying Scotland, known collectively to Romans as Caledonians, though comprising multiple distinct peoples with their own political organizations and territorial boundaries, employed defensive strategies that exploited their knowledge of local terrain while avoiding the set-piece battles where Roman military superiority would prove decisive. Agricola's response combined military expeditions that penetrated deep into Scottish territories with the construction of forts and roads designed to create permanent infrastructure supporting Roman occupation. The extent and ambition of Agricola's Scottish operations become apparent from archaeological evidence, revealing the construction of numerous forts and temporary camps extending northward along multiple parallel routes that suggests systematic campaigns involving multiple columns advancing in coordinated fashion. The fleet operations that Tacitus describes as circumnavigating Britain and discovering the Orkney Islands demonstrated Roman naval capabilities while providing logistical support for land forces operating at the limits of their supply lines. The decisive confrontation occurred at Mons Graupius in 83 or 84 AD, probably somewhere in northeastern Scotland, though the battle's precise location remains disputed among modern scholars, despite extensive archaeological investigation. Tacitus's detailed description of the battle, clearly based on accounts provided by eyewitnesses, including possibly Agricola himself, presents the engagement as a significant Roman victory that demonstrated Roman military superiority, while providing an opportunity for rhetorical elaboration on themes of liberty versus tyranny, through the speech attributed to the Caledonian leader Calgacus. The speech that Tacitus places in Calgacus's mouth before the battle, including the famous phrase about Romans creating desolation and calling it peace, represents Tacitus's literary skill rather than authentic British oratory, but reveals the Roman historian's own ambivalence about imperial expansion and the costs that conquest imposed on subjected peoples. The battle itself followed patterns characteristic of Roman encounters with tribal opponents, as British forces attempting to exploit superior numbers were defeated by Roman tactical superiority and the combined arms approach that integrated heavy infantry with auxiliary cavalry and specialized units. The decisive phase involved Roman auxiliary infantry bearing the brunt of fighting, while legionary troops held in reserve demonstrated the strategic depth that Roman command structures provided. Roman cavalry, deployed on the flanks, prevented British forces from enveloping Roman positions, while later in the battle, pursuing broken British formations and transforming organized resistance into chaotic flight. The battle's outcome, claimed by Tacitus as a decisive victory with 10,000 Caledonian casualties versus only 360 Roman losses, established Roman military dominance in northeastern Scotland and appeared to complete the conquest of Britain that Julius Caesar had initiated nearly 140 years earlier. However, the completeness of this victory would prove illusory, as strategic realities and imperial priorities would soon force reconsideration of whether the resources required to maintain control over northern Scotland justified the marginal benefits that occupation provided to imperial security and precedent economic interests. Agricola's recall to Rome in approximately 84 AD, occurring shortly after his apparent triumph at Mons Graupius, reflected the complex political dynamics that shaped Roman provincial administration and the relationship between successful commanders and emperors who feared that military accomplishments might generate popularity that could threaten imperial authority. The recall ended what Tacitus presents as an exemplary governorship that combined military success with administrative wisdom and cultural sophistication, though the historian's relationship to Agricola as son-in-law makes his account necessarily problematic as historical evidence, despite its literary brilliance. The immediate consequence of Agricola's departure involved gradual Roman withdrawal from the most advanced positions in Scotland, as subsequent governors recognized that maintaining the infrastructure and garrison forces necessary for controlling territories beyond the Forth-Clyde Isthmus consumed resources disproportionate to any military or economic benefits that occupation provided. The process of retrenchment proceeded gradually through the late 80s and 90s AD. As forts were abandoned, roads fell into disuse, and the Roman military frontier consolidated along more defensible and economically sustainable lines. The strategic logic favoring this withdrawal reflected broader patterns in Roman frontier policy during the later 1st century AD, as the Flavian dynasty's aggressive expansionism gave way to more conservative approaches that emphasized consolidation of existing territories over continued conquest of marginal lands that strained imperial resources without providing commensurate benefits. The transformation of Roman Britain during the later 1st century and early 2nd century AD involved processes that extended far beyond military operations and territorial consolidation to encompass fundamental changes in settlement, patterns, economic organization, social structures, and cultural practices that collectively converted tribal territories into functioning components of the Roman provincial system. The urban development that accelerated during this period created the characteristic settlement hierarchy that distinguished Roman provinces from the tribal societies they had replaced, with coloniae serving as settlements for veteran soldiers who received land grants as rewards for military service, municipia providing self-governing urban centers for established communities, and the network of smaller market towns and road stations facilitating commercial exchange and administrative coordination. The colonia at Camulodunum, despite its destruction during the Boudiccan revolt, was rebuilt and expanded to serve as a symbol of Roman permanence and cultural superiority, while new coloniae established at Lincoln and Gloucester provided additional centers for Roman settlement and cultural influence. The development of Londinium as the province's de facto capital, despite lacking formal colonial status, reflected the city's overwhelming economic importance as a commercial center whose merchants maintained trading relationships throughout the empire, while its administrative functions increasingly made it the focus of provincial government, despite the absence of imperial decision establishing this primacy. Archaeological evidence from Londinium reveals rapid growth during the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, as the city recovered from its Boudiccan destruction to become one of the empire's largest urban centers north of the Alps, with a population possibly approaching 30,000 inhabitants at its peak, and an urban infrastructure including a forum basilica complex, amphitheatre, and elaborate private residences that testified to the wealth concentrated in this commercial hub. The development of civitas capitals as administrative centers for tribal territories represented the primary mechanism through which Roman government extended its authority over the British population, while maintaining the fiction of local self-government through institutions that preserved the names and notional continuity of pre-conquest tribal organizations. Each civitas capital served as the urban center for a territorially defined administrative unit, corresponding roughly to pre-conquest tribal boundaries, with the city providing facilities for local government, religious observance, and commercial exchange that drew tribal populations into Roman administrative and cultural systems. The construction of monumental public architecture in these civitas capitals, typically including forum basilica complexes that combined governmental and commercial functions, temples devoted to Roman and Romano-British deities, and public baths that served both hygienic and social purposes, created urban landscapes visibly different from pre-conquest British settlements, while demonstrating the benefits that Roman rule purportedly provided to subject populations. The civitas capital of the Catuvellaoni at Verulamium, rebuilt following its Boudiccan destruction, developed as a substantial urban center whose archaeological remains reveal sophisticated urban planning, including a regular street grid, stone-built public buildings decorated with mosaics and wall paintings, and evidence of craft production that supported urban populations while supplying luxury goods for rural elites. Similar development occurred at other civitas capitals, including Venter Sillarum for the Silures in southern Wales, Venter Icenorum for the Iceni in East Anglia, and numerous other centres whose growth during the 2nd century AD demonstrated the gradual but substantial urbanization that Roman rule fostered, even in regions that had lacked significant urban settlement before conquest. The financing of urban construction projects relied primarily on local resources, mobilized through the civic pride and competitive ambition of local elites who sought status within the new Roman provincial society by funding public buildings that displayed their wealth and cultural sophistication while demonstrating their community's successful integration into the Roman world. The road network that Romans constructed throughout Britain created the infrastructure essential for military operations, administrative communications, and commercial exchange, while physically integrating the province through transportation routes that connected military installations, urban centres, and productive agricultural regions in systems that could move military reinforcements, official correspondence, and commercial goods with unprecedented speed and reliability. The major trunk roads, including Watling Street connecting Londinium with the northwest, Ermine Street linking Londinium with York and the northern frontier, and the Fosse Way that had defined the initial conquest frontier, formed the skeleton of a transportation network that eventually included thousands of miles of engineered roads whose construction quality and durability would preserve their routes through subsequent centuries and millennia. Roman road construction techniques, involving careful attention to drainage, the use of substantial foundations, and the creation of cambered surfaces that shed water, produced transportation infrastructure vastly superior to the trackways and paths that had previously connected British settlements. The surveyors who planned these routes demonstrated remarkable skill in identifying efficient paths through difficult terrain, while the engineering required to maintain relatively direct routes through varied topography, including cuttings, through hills, embankments across valleys, and bridges over rivers, showcased Roman technological capabilities. The regular spacing of road stations along major routes, typically positioned at intervals of approximately 15 to 20 Roman miles, provided accommodation and services for official travelers using the imperial post system, while creating commercial opportunities for local populations who supplied these facilities with food, fodder, and other necessities. The secondary road network, connecting civitas capitals with smaller settlements and agricultural estates, extended the primary trunk routes into comprehensive systems that served local economic development while facilitating the Pansixmai administrative supervision necessary for tax collection, legal jurisdiction, and military recruitment. The agricultural economy that sustained Roman Britain underwent significant transformations during the first 2 centuries AD, as traditional farming practices adapted to the demands of Roman taxation, the opportunities created by urban markets, and the availability of new crops and techniques introduced through contact with the broader Roman world. The villa system that developed, particularly in the southern and eastern lowlands, created nucleated agricultural settlements whose architecture reflected Roman residential patterns, while their economic organization focused on producing agricultural surplus for sale in urban markets rather than merely subsistence production for local consumption. The term villa encompasses a wide range of settlement types, from modest Romanized farmhouses differing little from traditional British roundhouses, except in their rectangular plans and occasional mosaic floors, to elaborate multi-winged complexes with sophisticated architectural features, including hypercoursed heating systems, bath suites, and extensive mosaic programs that demonstrated their owners' wealth and cultural sophistication. The distribution of villas concentrated in areas with favorable agricultural conditions and good access to markets, particularly the territories of southeastern tribes, including the Catuvellaoni, Trinovantes, and Atrebates, where villa development reached greatest density and architectural elaboration. The economic foundation of villa prosperity rested on grain production for urban markets and military supply, with wheat and barley comprising the primary crops supplemented by livestock raising that provided meat, leather, and wool for commercial sale. Archaeological evidence from villa sites reveals agricultural processing facilities, including granaries, barns, and what may have been threshing floors, suggesting that these estates functioned as integrated agricultural businesses that processed crops for market, rather than simply collecting rents from tenant farmers. The social structure of Romano-British society that developed during the first 2 centuries AD created hierarchies that combined elements of Roman class distinctions with continuities from pre-conquest British social organization, producing hybrid systems where Roman citizenship status, wealth, and cultural assimilation determined an individual's position within provincial society. The highest tier consisted of the provincial elite, including the descendants of tribal leaders who had cooperated with Rome during conquest and subsequently acquired Roman citizenship, successful merchants whose commercial activities generated the wealth necessary for political participation, and veteran soldiers whose military service earned them citizenship and land grants. These elites dominated the local government institutions, including town councils in coloniae and civitas capitals, holding magistracies that provided opportunities for public service and status enhancement, while requiring the financial contributions necessary for urban development and public amenities. The obligations that accompanied elite status, particularly the expectation that magistrates would fund public building projects, games, and other civic amenities from personal wealth, created competitive pressures that drove urban development while potentially impoverishing families who overextended themselves in pursuit of status and honor. The middle ranks of provincial society included successful farmers, craftsmen, and traders whose economic activities generated sufficient wealth for comfortable existence, though not the resources necessary for political participation at the highest levels. These middling groups increasingly adopted Roman material culture, including Romanized housing styles, mass-produced pottery that replaced traditional British ceramics, and personal items such as brooches and jewelry that followed Roman fashions. The lower social levels encompassed agricultural workers, urban laborers, slaves, and others whose marginal economic positions limited their ability to participate in the consumer economy that characterized Romanized urban centers. The military organization of Roman Britain underwent significant evolution during the first 2 centuries AD, as the initial conquest force of 4 legions and equivalent auxiliary units gradually transformed into a permanent garrison whose size, composition, and distribution reflected changing strategic priorities and the stabilization of frontier boundaries. The legion remained the fundamental unit of the Roman heavy infantry force, with each legion theoretically comprising approximately 5,000 soldiers, organized in cohorts and centuries that provided tactical flexibility while maintaining the discipline and unit cohesion necessary for complex military operations. The 4 legions initially deployed for the Claudian conquest were gradually redistributed as strategic requirements changed, with the 2nd Legion Augusta eventually stationed at Caerleon in Wales, the 9th Legion Hispana at York, until its mysterious disappearance from the historical record in the early 2nd century AD, the 14th Legion Gemina, serving in Britain, until withdrawn during the late 1st century AD to meet military requirements elsewhere in the empire, and the 20th Legion Valeria stationed at Chester, where it would remain throughout the Roman occupation. The permanent legionary fortresses, constructed at these locations, represented massive investments in military infrastructure, with elaborate stone-built fortifications, barracks, headquarters, buildings, workshops, hospitals, and granaries, creating self-contained military communities that dominated the urban landscapes of their host settlements. The auxiliary forces, recruited from non-citizen populations throughout the empire and organized in cohorts and cavalry alae, numbering approximately 500 or 1,000 men each, provided the tactical flexibility and specialized capabilities that complemented legionary heavy infantry. The distribution of auxiliary units throughout Britain, particularly along frontier zones and in areas where unrest remained possible, created a network of smaller forts that controlled strategic locations while providing military presence that reinforced Roman authority and maintained security for civilian populations. The religious transformation of Britain under Roman rule involved complex processes of accommodation, synthesis, and occasional conflict between Roman religious practices and traditional British beliefs, creating distinctive Romano-British religious forms that combined elements from multiple traditions while maintaining the essential polytheistic character that both Roman and Celtic religions shared. The Roman government's pragmatic approach to provincial religions, typically permitting and even encouraging the continuation of local religious practices, provided they did not threaten imperial authority or violate Roman sensibilities, enabled substantial continuity in British religious life, despite the dramatic political and cultural changes that conquest imposed. The process, known as interpretatio Romana, whereby Roman and Celtic deities were equated based on perceived similarities in their functions and attributes, facilitated this religious accommodation while creating hybrid forms whose worship satisfied both Roman expectations about proper religious observance and British attachment to traditional beliefs. The proliferation of dedications to deities with combined Romano-Celtic names, such as Sulis Minerva at Bath or Mars Carotiacus at various locations, demonstrates this synthesis, while the architectural forms in which these deities were worshipped, typically Romano-British temples combining Celtic square within square ground plans with Roman architectural details, created distinctive religious architecture that expressed Romano-British cultural identity. The imperial cult, requiring religious observances honoring the reigning emperor and the deified spirits of deceased emperors, represented the one Roman religious imposition that provincial populations could not avoid, as participation in imperial cult rituals served political as well as religious functions by demonstrating loyalty to imperial authority. The construction of temples devoted to imperial cult worship in major urban centers, including the massive temple to the deified Claudius at Camulodunum, whose maintenance costs had contributed to triggering the Boudiccan revolt, established the physical infrastructure for these observances, while their elaboration created opportunities for local elites to display loyalty and compete for imperial favor through the priesthoods and ceremonies associated with imperial paritas worship. The arrival of Christianity in Britain, occurring probably during the 2nd century AD, though the precise chronology remains uncertain due to limited evidence, introduced a religious system fundamentally incompatible with the polytheistic tolerance that had characterized both Roman and Celtic religious traditions. The exclusive monotheism that Christianity demanded, requiring adherents to reject participation in the traditional religious observances that maintained social bonds and demonstrated civic loyalty, created tensions with Roman authorities who viewed Christian refusal to perform required rituals as treasonous disloyalty rather than legitimate religious conviction. The persecution of Christians that occurred sporadically throughout the empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, driven by local officials' concerns about Christian exclusivity rather than centrally directed imperial policy, appears to have affected Britain, though the scale and severity of persecution in the province remains difficult to assess from limited evidence. The martyrdom of Saint Alban, traditionally dated to the 3rd century AD, though the historical reliability of the accounts remains problematic, became a foundational narrative for British Christianity, while establishing Verulamium as a significant pilgrimage site following Christianity's eventual imperial recognition. The Christian community in Britain remained relatively small until the 4th century AD, when imperial religious policy reversed course and Christianity transformed from persecuted minority to officially favored religion, enjoying imperial patronage and gradually displacing traditional religious practices. The construction of Hadrian's Wall, beginning in approximately 122 AD following Emperor Hadrian's visit to Britain, represented the most ambitious military engineering project undertaken in the province and created the most substantial and enduring physical monument to Roman presence in Britain. Hadrian's frontier policy, reversing the expansionist approach of his predecessor Trajan to emphasize consolidation and clear demarcation of imperial boundaries, applied throughout the empire, but found its most dramatic expression in Britain, where the wall created a permanent barrier between Roman-controlled territories and the unconquered regions beyond. The wall's route, following the Tyne-Solway Isthmus, where the narrow distance between the North Sea and Irish Sea coasts provided the shortest possible line for a cross-country barrier, demonstrated careful strategic planning while exploiting natural defensive advantages where the windsill outcrop provided elevated positions overlooking approaches from the north. The original design specifications called for a stone wall approximately 10 Roman feet thick and probably 15 to 20 feet high, extending approximately 80 Roman miles from Wallsend in the east to Bowness on Solway in the west, with regularly spaced mile castles, providing accommodation for small garrisons, while intervening turrets enabled surveillance of the wall's northern approaches. The construction process, involving all three legions stationed in Britain, whose soldiers worked in rotating shifts, while their distinctive construction techniques and unit stamps on building stones enable modern archaeologists to identify which legion built. Particular sections proceeded from east to west, with the eastern sections built to the original specifications, while the western sections saw modifications that included reducing the wall's thickness to approximately 8 Roman feet, in what is known as the narrow wall specification. The ditch north of the wall, excavated to a depth of approximately 10 feet and width of 30 feet, except where geological conditions made excavation impractical, provided an additional obstacle to anyone attempting to cross the frontier, while the vallum south of the wall, consisting of a flat-bottomed ditch with flanking earthen banks, appears to have served administrative functions by demarcating the military zone from civilian territories to the south. The military installations associated with Hadrian's Wall created a complex defensive system that integrated multiple elements designed to provide surveillance, rapid response to incursions, and accommodation for the substantial garrison forces necessary for frontier security. The 16 full-size forts positioned along the wall at irregular intervals, averaging approximately 7 miles, but varying based on local terrain and strategic requirements, each housed auxiliary cohorts of infantry or cavalry units, numbering between 500 and 1,000 soldiers, whose presence provided the military strength necessary for responding to raids or preventing unauthorized crossings. The positioning of these forts, which represented a modification to the original wall design, as initial planning apparently envisioned forts located behind the wall rather than integrated into it, created a defensive system that could concentrate forces rapidly at threatened points while maintaining sufficient dispersion to monitor the entire frontier. The forts themselves followed standardized layouts with stone walls enclosing rectangular areas containing barracks, headquarters buildings, commandants' houses, granaries, hospitals, and other structures necessary for permanent military occupation. The vicus settlements that developed outside fort gates housed the civilian populations, including soldiers' families, merchants, craftsmen, and service providers whose presence created permanent communities dependent on military spending and administratively separate from the military installations themselves, but economically integrated through the markets and services that supplied garrison needs. The garrison strength, associated with Hadrian's Wall at its peak, probably approached 10,000 soldiers, representing a substantial proportion of the total military forces stationed in Britain, and demonstrating the strategic importance that Roman authorities assigned to frontier security and the prevention of raiding activity that could disrupt the peaceful provinces to the south. The Antonine Wall, constructed beginning in approximately 142 AD during the reign of Antoninus Pius, represented a temporary revival of forward frontier policy that advanced the Roman military boundary northward to the Fourth Clyde Isthmus, where Agricola's campaigns 60 years earlier had demonstrated that a defensible line could be established. The decision to construct this new frontier, abandoning Hadrian's Wall, which had been operational for less than 20 years, reflected the new emperor's desire to emulate his predecessor's military achievements while pursuing the glory that successful frontier campaigns could provide, even though the actual military threat from Caledonian tribes hardly justified the enormous resources required for constructing and garrisoning an advanced frontier. The Antonine Wall, extending approximately 37 Roman miles between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, followed the shortest practicable line for a cross-country barrier in Scotland, while its construction specifications differed significantly from Hadrian's Wall by utilizing a stone foundation supporting a turf rampart, rather than the solid stone wall construction employed in the earlier frontier. The reduced scale of the Antonine Wall with its rampart width of approximately 14 feet at base and probable height of approximately 10 feet, reflected both the different construction materials and the more limited strategic ambitions underlying this frontier compared to Hadrian's Wall, which had been conceived as a permanent boundary of the empire. The 19 forts positioned along the Antonine Wall at much closer intervals than Hadrian's Wall forts, averaging approximately 2 miles, created a garrison system that emphasized surveillance and rapid response over the provision of concentrated military strength at key strategic positions. The reduced distance between forts suggested expectations of more intense military activity, requiring closer coordination between garrison units, while the relatively small size of many Antonine Wall forts indicated that they housed detachments rather than complete auxiliary units. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall, occurring probably around 164 AD after approximately 20 years of occupation, reflected the strategic reality that maintaining an advanced frontier in Scotland consumed resources disproportionate to any military or economic benefits, while the territories between the two walls remained incompletely pacified, required continuing military presence that complicated logistics and reduced the available forces for frontier garrisons. The process of withdrawal proceeded in stages, with some forts abandoned earlier than others as garrison requirements changed and military priorities shifted, eventually resulting in the reoccupation of Hadrian's Wall as the permanent northern frontier of Roman Britain for the remainder of the occupation period. The reasons for abandoning the Antonine Wall probably involved multiple factors, including military pressures elsewhere in the empire that required the transfer of forces from Britain, the practical difficulties of supplying and reinforcing garrisons positioned far north of the province's productive agricultural regions, and the limited strategic value of controlling territories whose sparse populations and limited resources provided minimal economic benefit, while their hostile inhabitants required constant military supervision. The restoration of Hadrian's Wall to operational status required substantial reconstruction work, as the frontier installations had deteriorated during the period when garrison forces had been transferred north, with archaeological evidence revealing major rebuilding programs that restored military infrastructure to functional condition. The brief occupation of the Antonine Wall, though representing a strategic failure in terms of establishing permanent control over southern Scotland, demonstrated Roman military capability to project power northward when imperial policy demanded, while its eventual abandonment reflected the pragmatic assessment that frontier policy should balance security requirements against available resources and realistic strategic objectives. The 3rd century AD brought challenges that fundamentally tested the Roman provincial system in Britain, as throughout the empire. As political instability in Rome, military pressures along multiple frontiers, economic disruption, and social transformation created the crisis of the 3rd century that threatened to fragment the empire into competing regional powers. The period beginning with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 AD and extending through Diocletian's accession in 284 AD witnessed unprecedented political chaos as military units throughout the empire elevated their commanders to imperial power, creating rapid succession of emperors whose brief reigns often ended in violent death, and whose limited territorial control reduced the central government's ability to coordinate defense or maintain administrative coherence. Britain experienced these disruptions both through the direct impact of political upheaval in the province and through the indirect effects of imperial crisis that reduced the resources available for frontier defense and provincial administration. The northern frontier faced increasing pressure during this period from Caledonian tribes whose raids penetrated Roman territories with growing frequency and destructiveness, requiring military responses that strained the garrison forces while disrupting the civilian populations who bore the direct costs of raiding activity. The governorship of Ulpius Marcellus in the early 180s AD, involving military campaigns against northern tribes and the restoration of frontier defenses, demonstrated both the seriousness of northern threats and the continuing capability of Roman military forces to respond effectively when provided with adequate resources and competent leadership. The separation of Britain from imperial control during the reign of Septimius Severus's rival, Clodius Albinus, who served as governor of Britain before declaring himself emperor and crossing to Gaul with substantial military forces drawn from the British garrison, created a crisis that threatened the province's security while demonstrating the strategic importance of Britain's military resources in imperial power struggles. Albinus's defeat and death at the Battle of Lugdunum in 197 AD resulted in punitive measures against British communities that had supported him, while the withdrawal of military forces for his continental campaign had left the northern frontier vulnerable to raids that caused substantial damage to military installations and civilian settlements. Severus's personal campaign in Britain between 208 and 211 AD, undertaken despite his advanced age and failing health, reflected both the seriousness of northern frontier problems and the political benefits that successful military operations could provide for an emperor whose authority rested on military support. The massive military operations that Severus conducted in Scotland, involving penetrations deep into Caledonian territories and the construction of numerous temporary camps that archaeological evidence reveals extending far into northeastern Scotland, demonstrated the continuing capability of Roman military power to dominate tribal opponents through superior organization and logistics. The campaign's limited strategic achievements, as Caledonian tribes avoided direct confrontation while harassing Roman supply lines and retreating into territories where Roman forces struggled to maintain themselves, demonstrated the continuing validity of defensive strategies that British tribes had employed since the initial Roman conquest. Severus's death at York in 211 AD ended the Scottish campaigns as his son and successor Caracalla negotiated peace arrangements that withdrew Roman forces behind Hadrian's Wall, while purchasing security through subsidies paid to tribal leaders whose cooperation ensured frontier stability. The administrative reorganization of Britain during the early 3rd century AD, dividing the single province into two separate units known as Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior, with their capitals at Londinium and York respectively, reflected broader imperial policies aimed at reducing the concentration of military power under individual governors, whose control over multiple legions and substantial resources created potential threats to imperial stability. The division separated the militarized northern zones, including the two legions at York and Chester under the governor of Britannia Inferior, from the more peaceful southern regions where the legion at Caerleon and the civilian administrative apparatus came under the governor of Britannia Superior's authority. This administrative structure remained in place until the late 3rd century, when Diocletian's comprehensive administrative reforms further subdivided Britain into 4 provinces as part of empire-wide reorganization that created smaller provincial units governed by civilian officials, while military command was separated from civil administration under specialized commanders. The economic impact of 3rd century disruptions on Romano-British society remains debated among modern scholars, with archaeological evidence providing contradictory signals about whether the province experienced decline, comparable to some continental regions, or maintained relatively stable conditions due to its peripheral position, protecting it from the direct military conflicts that devastated frontier zones elsewhere. The apparent continuation of urban life and villa construction through much of the 3rd century suggests that Romano-British society retained substantial prosperity despite political uncertainties, though evidence from some urban sites, including Londinium, indicates contraction from the peak population levels of the 2nd century AD. The emergence of the Gallic Empire under Postumus in 260 AD, separating Britain, Gaul, and Spain from central imperial control for approximately 15 years, demonstrated the fragmentation that political instability could produce, while also revealing the continuing vitality of Romano-British society and economy that sustained independent political organization. The Gallic Empire's administration, maintaining Roman governmental structures and claiming legitimate imperial authority rather than representing separatist movements, preserved administrative continuity and frontier defense while redirecting tax revenues from Rome to regional needs, including military pay and frontier fortifications. Britain's integration into this breakaway empire occurred apparently without resistance, suggesting that Romano-British populations and military forces viewed the Gallic Empire as providing more effective government than the embattled central authorities could offer during this crisis period. The restoration of Britain to central imperial control under Emperor Aurelian in 274 AD occurred peacefully through diplomatic negotiations, rather than military conquest, reflecting the Gallic Empire's internal weaknesses and the practical recognition among its leaders that long-term independence from Rome was unsustainable. The usurpation of Carausius, the commander of the Channel Fleet, who declared himself emperor in 286 or 287 AD and controlled Britain and parts of northern Gaul for approximately 7 years, represented another episode in the fragmentation that characterized this crisis period. Carausius's regime, maintaining elaborate administrative structures and conducting successful military operations against Saxon and Frankish raiders who increasingly threatened Channel security, demonstrated effective government, while his propaganda, emphasizing his role as Britain's legitimate protector, sought to build popular support for his regime. The assassination of Carausius by his finance minister Alectus in 293 AD and the subsequent reconquest of Britain by forces loyal to Emperor Constantius Chlorus in 296 AD finally restored stable imperial control after 3 decades of separation or semi-independence. The 4th century AD brought significant transformations to Romano-British society, economy, and culture. As Christianity spread through provincial populations, urban centers experienced changes in function and organization, and the military system adapted to evolving threats from raiders who increasingly targeted Britain's exposed coastlines. The conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity in the early 4th century, followed by his successor's promotion of Christianity as the empire's favored religion, created conditions for rapid Christian expansion in Britain, as in other provinces. The British bishops who attended the Council of Arles in 314 AD and the Council of Rimini in 359 AD demonstrated the development of ecclesiastical organization, while Christian communities established churches in major urban centers and gradually displaced traditional religious practices. The archaeological evidence for Christianity in 4th century Britain includes churches identified at sites including Silchester and possible church structures at other urban locations, though the scale and pace of Christianization remains debated, with some scholars emphasizing substantial pagan continuity, while others argue for more comprehensive Christian conversion. The construction of Christian buildings and the burial practices that increasingly reflected Christian beliefs, including the orientation of graves toward the east and the absence of grave goods that had characterized pagan burials, provide material evidence for religious change, though the interpretation of this evidence remains complicated by the difficulty of distinguishing Christian from pagan practices in borderline cases. The continued vitality of villa construction and elaboration during the 4th century, particularly in the period before approximately 360 AD, demonstrates that Romano-British society retained substantial wealth and confidence in the future, with villa owners investing in architectural improvements, including mosaic floors, bath suites, and sophisticated heating systems that represented significant capital expenditures. The military threats facing 4th century Britain evolved from the frontier warfare with Caledonian tribes that had characterized earlier periods to include seaborne raids by Saxon pirates from Germanic territories across the north, sea and Scots raiders from Ireland who targeted Britain's western coasts. The Roman response involved construction of the Saxon shore fort system, a chain of massive fortified installations extending along the southeastern and eastern coasts from the Wash to the Solent, that provided bases for naval and military forces charged with protecting vulnerable coastal regions from maritime raiding. These forts, including Brancaster, Burgh Castle, Walton Castle, Bradwell, Reculver, Richborough, Dover, Lympne, Pevensey, and Portchester, represented sophisticated military architecture with massive walls, projecting towers enabling enfilade fire along wall faces, and designs adapted for accommodating both garrison troops and naval forces, whose ships could dock within or adjacent to the forts. The command structure for Saxon shore defences, unified under a specialised officer known as the Count of the Saxon Shore, who commanded the forts and their garrisons, created coordinated defense systems that could respond to raids while maintaining communication and mutual support between installations. The effectiveness of these fortifications in preventing or limiting raiding damage remains uncertain, as historical sources provide limited information about their operational history, though their continued occupation and periodic reconstruction indicate that Roman authorities maintained commitment to coastal defense throughout the 4th century. The barbarian conspiracy of 367 AD, involving coordinated attacks on Britain by Picts from Scotland, Scots from Ireland, and Saxon raiders from across the North Sea, created the most serious security crisis of the 4th century and revealed vulnerabilities in Roman defensive systems that had developed during decades of relative peace. The conspiracy's name, derived from the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus's account, suggesting coordination among different raiding groups, may exaggerate the degree of actual planning, while the simultaneous attacks probably reflected opportunistic exploitation of Roman military weakness rather than elaborate strategic collaboration. The impact of these raids extended deep into Roman territories, with archaeological evidence from villa sites and urban centers revealing destruction layers dated to this period, while Ammianus describes widespread disruption, including the killing or capture of high-ranking Roman officials. The Roman response, led by Count Theodosius, who arrived in Britain in 368 AD with substantial military reinforcements, involved systematic campaigns to restore security, reconstruct damaged fortifications, and reorganize military forces to prevent future disasters. Theodosius's success in restoring order and reconstructing defensive systems demonstrated continuing Roman military capability, while his reported leniency toward deserters and his efforts to address the corruption and incompetence that had contributed to the crisis reflected sophisticated understanding of the political and administrative dimensions of military problems. The aftermath of the barbarian conspiracy saw increased fortification of urban centers, with many towns constructing or expanding defensive walls during the late 4th century, a development suggesting reduced confidence in the military's ability to prevent raiding activity and increased emphasis on local defense capabilities. The religious controversies that divided 4th century Christianity, particularly the Arian dispute about the nature of Christ's divinity and the Pelagian controversy about grace and free will, affected Britain as throughout the empire, though the province's peripheral position may have insulated it somewhat from the intensity of theological conflict that characterized the Eastern Empire and Mediterranean regions. The Pelagian controversy possessed particular British connections, as Pelagius himself was possibly of British origin, while his teachings about human moral capability and the role of individual will in salvation attracted followers in Britain even after church councils condemned his doctrines as heretical. The mission of Germanus of Auxerre to Britain in 429 AD, and again in the mid-440s AD, undertaken to combat Pelagian influence and restore orthodox teaching, provides evidence both of continued Romano-British ecclesiastical organization, capable of requesting external assistance, and of the theological disputes that engaged Christian communities. Germanus's hagiography describes him leading British forces to victory against Saxon and Pictish raiders through the famous Alleluia victory, where massed shouting of Christian liturgical responses supposedly panicked the enemies without requiring actual combat, though this account's reliability as history remains questionable, while its hagiographical purposes are obvious. The economic changes of the late 4th century, including apparent decline in villa occupation and modification of urban commercial districts, suggest disruptions to the prosperity that had characterized earlier periods, though the interpretation of this evidence remains contested among scholars who debate whether changes reflect economic decline, reorganization of settlement patterns, or transformations in archaeological visibility, rather than absolute reduction in prosperity or population. The end of Roman rule in Britain occurred through processes fundamentally different from those that characterized the empire's collapse in other Western provinces, as Britain experienced administrative and military withdrawal rather than conquest by foreign invaders or the establishment of successor kingdoms by federated barbarian groups who had been settled within imperial territories. The historical narratives that might document this transition were never written or have not survived, leaving modern historians dependent on fragmentary evidence and later legendary accounts that preserve distorted memories of events whose actual character remains irrecoverable. The traditional date of 410 AD for Roman withdrawal derived from references in later sources, suggesting that Emperor Honorius responded to a British appeal for military assistance by instructing provincial communities to organize their own defense, represents at best a symbolic moment within extended processes of disengagement that probably unfolded across several decades of the early 5th century. The withdrawal of military forces from Britain began before 410 AD, as imperial authorities facing threats to Italy and Gaul from Gothic and other invaders withdrew units from peripheral provinces to concentrate forces for defending the empire's Mediterranean core. The usurper Constantine III, proclaimed emperor by troops in Britain in 407 AD, crossed to Gaul with substantial military forces drawn from the British garrison, continuing the pattern established by Clodius Albinus 2 centuries earlier, whereby Britain's garrison provided military resources for imperial contenders. Constantine's eventual defeat and execution in 411 AD left Britain denuded of regular military forces, while the collapse of his regime eliminated any prospect of restoring central imperial administration in the province. The archaeological evidence from early 5th century Britain reveals patterns consistent with administrative collapse and economic disruption rather than military conquest. As urban centers show reduced occupation intensity, coin circulation ceased by approximately 410 AD, indicating the breakdown of monetary economy and military pay systems, and pottery production shifted from mass-manufactured wares, distributed through commercial networks, to locally produced ceramics, serving reduced market areas. The villa system that had characterized Romano-British rural settlement patterns disintegrated during the early 5th century, with most villas abandoned by mid-century, though a few may have maintained occupation under transformed conditions with reduced architectural maintenance and modified economic functions. The causes of villa abandonment remain debated, with explanations ranging from economic collapse that eliminated the commercial agriculture supporting villa prosperity to security problems that made dispersed rural settlement untenable to social changes that ended the elite lifestyle that villas represented. The continuity of occupation at some urban sites into the 5th century and beyond suggests that Romano-British society did not immediately collapse following administrative withdrawal, though the character of urban life transformed as Roman governmental structures, commercial systems, and cultural institutions ceased to function. The British appeal to the Roman general Aetius, around 446 AD, preserved in fragmentary form and known as the Groans of the Britons, represents one of the few contemporary references to conditions in 5th century Britain, describing Saxon attacks and requesting military assistance that Aetius, facing the threat of Attila's Hunnic invasions in Gaul, was unable to provide. The Saxon settlement of eastern Britain, traditionally dated to the mid-5th century, though probably involving processes that began earlier and extended over decades, represented the beginning of the ethnic and cultural transformation that would ultimately create Anglo-Saxon England from the ruins of Roman Britain. The early phases of Saxon settlement remain extremely difficult to document archaeologically, as the material culture of early Germanic settlers was not dramatically different from that of late Roman provincial populations, while the absence of historical sources means that the chronology, scale, and character of settlement can only be inferred from fragmentary evidence. The traditional narrative, preserved in sources written centuries later, including Bede's Ecclesiastical History and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describes Saxon mercenaries invited by British leaders to assist in defense against Pictish and Scottish raids, who subsequently revolted and established their own kingdoms, though the reliability of these much later accounts remains questionable. The archaeological evidence suggests that Germanic settlement began in coastal regions of eastern England and gradually expanded westward, with distinctive burial practices, including cremation and the deposition of characteristic grave goods, enabling identification of Germanic populations distinct from Romano-British communities. The relationship between Germanic settlers and Romano-British populations, whether involving conquest and displacement, gradual infiltration and cultural dominance, or some combination of these processes, remains actively debated among scholars whose interpretations reflect different assessments of the available evidence and different methodological approaches to early medieval archaeology. The survival of Romano-British populations in Western Britain, particularly in Wales, Cornwall, and the Northwest, created regions where Latin Christian culture and memory of Roman civilization persisted through the early medieval period, despite the collapse of Roman political and administrative structures. The British kingdoms that emerged in these regions, including Gwynedd, Powys, Dumnonia, and others, maintained political independence from Saxon kingdoms while preserving cultural traditions including Latin literacy, Christian religious organization, and memory of Roman imperial authority that distinguished them from the pagan Germanic populations settling eastern England. The legendary figure of Arthur, whose historical existence remains uncertain, and whose later medieval elaboration as the perfect Christian king bore little resemblance to any historical 5th or 6th century British leader, probably originated from memories of British military resistance to Saxon expansion during this transition period. The historical Arthur, if such a person existed, was most likely a British military leader who achieved temporary successes in resisting Saxon expansion during the late 5th or early 6th century AD, with the Battle of Badon mentioned by the British writer Gildas as a significant British victory that temporarily halted Saxon advance. The transformation of this possible historical figure into the legendary king of medieval romance involved centuries of literary elaboration that progressively added elements from multiple sources, including Celtic mythology, French chivalric traditions, and Christian religious symbolism that created a character bearing no resemblance to historical reality. The legacy of Roman rule in Britain manifested in multiple dimensions of subsequent British development, despite the collapse of Roman political and administrative structures and the Germanic conquest of eastern regions that obliterated Roman cultural patterns in these areas. The physical infrastructure of Roman Britain, particularly the road network and the urban foundations at sites that would later revive as medieval towns, provided lasting influences on British settlement patterns and transportation systems that persisted through subsequent centuries. Many Roman roads remained in use throughout the medieval period and beyond, their superior construction and strategic routing making them valuable transportation routes, even after the original imperial administrative purposes they had served ceased to exist. The urban sites established during the Roman period frequently became medieval towns, though often after periods of abandonment or reduced occupation during the transition from Roman to medieval settlement patterns. The locations that Romans had selected for urban development, typically based on considerations including strategic position, access to transportation routes, and proximity to productive agricultural regions, retained advantages that made them attractive for later urban development. The survival of Latin literacy in British Christian communities ensured that memory of Roman civilization, however distorted and idealized, influenced medieval British culture and provided connections to the broader tradition of Christian Latin learning that shaped medieval European intellectual life. The Romano-British Church, maintaining organizational structures and Latin liturgical traditions, despite the disruptions of the 5th and 6th centuries, provided continuity that would later facilitate the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms through missions launched from British territories and from Rome. The archaeological investigation of Roman Britain, beginning systematically in the 19th century and continuing with increasing sophistication through the 20th and 21st centuries, has revealed the scale and complexity of Roman provincial society in Britain, while demonstrating the lasting physical presence of Roman occupation through monuments, structures, and artifacts that survive nearly 2 millennia after the empire's collapse. The excavation of major sites, including Hadrian's Wall, legionary fortresses, urban centers, and villas, has produced detailed understanding of Roman military organization, urban development, economic systems, and domestic life, while specialized studies of artifacts, including pottery, metalwork, and coinage, have illuminated trade patterns, technological capabilities, and cultural practices. The application of scientific techniques, including radiocarbon dating, chemical analysis of materials, and geophysical survey methods, has enhanced archaeological capability to investigate Roman sites while providing data that enables more precise chronologies and more comprehensive understanding of site functions and development. The preservation of waterlogged deposits at sites including Vindolanda, where anaerobic conditions have preserved organic materials, including wooden writing tablets, documenting military correspondence and administrative records, has provided unprecedented direct evidence for Roman military life and the literacy that characterized even relatively junior officers and personnel. The Vindolanda tablets, discovered beginning in the 1970s AD and numbering hundreds of documents, include military reports, supply requisitions, personal correspondence, and various administrative records that reveal intimate details of garrison life, including birthday party invitations, requests for warm clothing, and complaints about road conditions that humanize Roman military personnel in ways that formal historical sources never accomplish. The ongoing archaeological investigation of Roman Britain continues to produce new discoveries and interpretations that refine understanding, while public interest in Roman history sustains tourism focused on Roman monuments and supports museum collections that preserve and display artifacts documenting Britain's Roman past. The enduring fascination with Roman Britain reflects both the dramatic character of conquest and occupation narratives and the tangible physical remains that enable direct connection with this distant past through monuments and artifacts that provide material links to the Roman world that shaped Britain's development during nearly 4 centuries of imperial rule. The consolidation of Roman control over the lowland regions of Britain proceeded with systematic efficiency in the 2 decades following the initial invasion, as successive governors extended military authority westward toward the Welsh Massif and northward into the Pennine uplands, while simultaneously establishing the administrative and infrastructural framework that would transform conquered territory into a functioning provincial entity. Aulus Plautius, who remained as the first provincial governor until 47 AD, organized the initial territorial divisions and established the colonia at Camulodunum, where a temple to the deified Claudius would serve as the symbolic center of imperial cult worship and a physical manifestation of Rome's permanent presence in the island. The veteran legionaries settled at Camulodunum received land confiscated from the Trinovantes, creating immediate tensions as displaced British landowners found themselves subordinated to foreign settlers who occupied their ancestral territories and demanded services and supplies without compensation. This colonial settlement, intended to provide a stable core of Roman citizens who would anchor imperial authority in the newly conquered region, instead became a focal point of resentment that would erupt with catastrophic consequences within 2 decades. The construction of the temple complex at Camulodunum, financed through compulsory contributions from native British communities already struggling under the weight of taxation and requisitions, represented not merely religious architecture, but a permanent symbol of subjugation that consumed enormous resources while producing no tangible benefit for the indigenous population who paid for its construction. The military campaigns that extended Roman control beyond the initial beachhead territories required sustained operations against tribal confederations that possessed neither the political unity nor the military organization to coordinate. Effective resistance, but nonetheless mounted fierce, localized opposition that slowed the pace of conquest and necessitated the establishment of permanent military installations throughout the newly occupied regions. Ostorius Scapula, who succeeded Plautius as governor in 47 AD, immediately confronted uprisings among the Iceni in East Anglia and tribes in the Welsh borderlands, requiring military expeditions that revealed the fragility of Roman control beyond the areas of direct military occupation. The Iceni, who had initially allied with Rome during the invasion and retained nominal independence as a client kingdom, rebelled against Roman attempts to disarm the native population, a policy that threatened their social structure and military traditions, while demonstrating that Roman concepts of peace required the monopolization of armed force by imperial authorities. Scapula's suppression of this uprising and his subsequent campaigns against the Desangli in northeastern Wales and the establishment of a legionary fortress at Lindum demonstrated the expansionist momentum that would drive Roman military operations throughout the conquest period, as each secured frontier immediately became the launching point for further advances into unconquered territory. The construction of fortified roads connecting military installations created permanent infrastructure that facilitated rapid troop movements, while simultaneously serving as visible assertions of Roman power cutting through previously autonomous tribal territories. The resistance, organized by Caratacus, who had fled westward after the defeat at the Medway and established himself among the Cilias and Ordovices in Wales, represented the most sustained military challenge to Roman expansion in Britain, and demonstrated both the potential for effective native resistance and the ultimate futility of opposing Roman military superiority without external support or strategic depth. Caratacus, utilizing his prestige as a defeated but unsubdued leader and his understanding of Roman military methods gained through direct experience, organized guerrilla operations that exploited the difficult terrain of the Welsh Highlands and the logistical challenges facing Roman forces operating far from their supply bases. His strategy of avoiding pitched battles while launching raids against Roman supply lines and isolated garrisons forced the Romans to commit substantial military resources to operations in Wales, disrupting the broader conquest timetable and demonstrating that even a fragmented resistance could impose significant costs on the occupying power. Scapula's campaigns against the Cilias proved particularly difficult, as this warrior society, inhabiting the uplands of southeastern Wales, possessed both the military capability and the geographic advantages necessary to sustain prolonged resistance, inflicting casualties on Roman forces and destroying entire auxiliary units in ambushes that revealed the limitations of Roman tactical superiority in broken terrain where heavy infantry could not exploit their organizational advantages. The Cilias' fierce independence and their refusal to submit even after the capture of Caratacus in 51 AD would continue to pose security challenges for 2 decades, requiring sustained military pressure and the construction of a dense network of forts that gradually restricted their operational freedom while consuming resources that might otherwise have been deployed to accelerate the northern forts. Campaigns. The capture of Caratacus following his defeat in a pitched battle somewhere in the Welsh borderlands in 51 AD, after he had sought refuge among the Brigantes in northern Britain, only to be betrayed by Queen Cartimandua and handed over to Roman authorities, marked a significant propaganda victory for Rome, while simultaneously revealing the internal divisions within British society that had facilitated the conquest and would continue to enable Roman control. The delivery of Caratacus to Rome and his appearance in Claudius's triumph transformed a persistent military irritant into a demonstration of Roman power and imperial clemency. As the captured resistance leader, rather than being executed as was customary for defeated enemies, was permitted to deliver a speech acknowledging Roman superiority, and was subsequently pardoned and allowed to live out his life in comfortable captivity in Rome. This calculated demonstration of imperial mercy served multiple purposes, rewarding Cartimandua for her cooperation, while advertising to other British leaders that collaboration offered better prospects than resistance, and transforming a figure who might have become a martyr for British independence into a living symbol of Rome's ability to incorporate even its most determined opponents into the imperial system. Cartimandua's decision to surrender Caratacus reflected the complex calculations of client rulers attempting to maintain their position within the new political order, as her cooperation with Rome secured her kingdom's nominal independence and Roman support for her authority against internal rivals, though at the cost of her legitimacy among those who viewed collaboration as betrayal. The Brigantian kingdom, under Cartimandua's rule, would remain nominally independent for 2 decades, serving Roman interests by providing a buffer zone between the militarized southern regions and the unconquered territories of northern Britain. While its internal political instability repeatedly required Roman military intervention to maintain a cooperative regime in power, the governorship of Suetonius Paulinus, who arrived in Britain in 58 AD with imperial authorization to complete the conquest of Wales and extend Roman control to the entire island, initiated a phase of aggressive military expansion that would culminate in the campaign against the Druidic sanctuary on Anglesey, and the simultaneous eruption of the Boudican revolt, the most serious crisis faced by Roman Britain in its first century of existence. Paulinus, an experienced military commander who had previously conducted successful campaigns in Mauritania, brought both tactical expertise and a determination to eliminate the centers of native resistance that had sustained opposition to Roman rule, identifying the Druidic communities of Wales as ideological opponents whose religious authority and political influence provided organizational coherence to tribal resistance movements. The Druids, whose role as religious specialists, legal authorities, and preservers of traditional knowledge gave them enormous influence across tribal boundaries, represented from the Roman perspective, a fifth column whose loyalty to indigenous traditions and opposition to Roman cultural transformation made them inherently subversive elements that needed to be eliminated if British society was to be successfully integrated into the imperial system. The concentration of Druidic communities on Anglesey, where refugees from Roman-occupied territories had joined the established religious centres to create a sanctuary for traditional British culture, made the island a strategic target whose conquest would serve both military and ideological purposes, eliminating a haven for resistors while demonstrating that no corner of Britain remained beyond Roman reach. The campaign against Anglesey in 60 AD required specialized military techniques to cross the Menai Strait, as Roman engineers constructed flat-bottomed boats to transport infantry, while cavalry forded the strait at low tide, allowing Paulinus to land forces on the island, despite determined opposition from defenders, who understood that the loss of this final sanctuary would mark the effective end of organized resistance to Roman rule. The battle accounts preserved in Roman sources, while colored by propaganda purposes, convey the psychological intensity of the encounter, as Roman soldiers confronted not only armed warriors, but druids and women who cursed the invaders and called upon supernatural powers to destroy them, creating a scene that momentarily unnerved even experienced legionaries before discipline and training reasserted control, and the Romans advanced to overwhelm the defenders. The systematic destruction of the sacred groves on Anglesey and the slaughter of the Druidic community represented cultural genocide, intended to eliminate the institutional basis for native religious tradition and the organizational structures that had coordinated resistance to Roman rule, replacing indigenous belief systems with Roman religious forms that integrated worship of traditional gods with the imperial cult and other Roman religious practices. The campaign's apparent success, however, was immediately overshadowed by news that a massive uprising had erupted in the Roman-controlled southeastern regions of the province, requiring Paulinus to abandon his Welsh operations and march his legions eastward to confront an existential threat to Roman Britain's survival. The Boudican revolt of 60 to 61 AD emerged from accumulated grievances related to the predatory behavior of Roman officials and financiers who treated the client kingdoms and nominally allied tribes as territories ripe for exploitation, extracting wealth through taxation, demanding repayment of forced loans, and seizing property without legal justification in a pattern of abuse that convinced substantial portions of the British population that Roman rule meant permanent subjugation rather than incorporation into a system that might offer them opportunities for advancement within the imperial structure. The immediate trigger for the uprising involved the treatment of the Iceni following the death of their king Prasutagus, who had attempted to secure his kingdom's future by naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his daughters, hoping that this gesture would guarantee Roman protection for his family and kingdom, while maintaining some degree of autonomy for his people. Roman officials, however, interpreted this inheritance as an opportunity for annexation, seizing Icenian property, flogging Prasutagus' widow Boudica when she protested, raping her daughters, and reducing the tribal aristocracy to subject status in a display of casual brutality that transformed a client kingdom into occupied territory overnight. The procurator, Catus Decianus, responsible for financial administration in the province, simultaneously demanded repayment of loans that Claudius had allegedly granted to British leaders during the initial conquest, loans that the recipients had understood as gifts rather than debts. creating immediate financial crises for tribal elites who lacked the liquid resources to satisfy Roman demands and faced property confiscation if they could not produce the required payments. The extraordinary violence that characterized the Boudiccan revolt, particularly the destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, and the slaughter of their inhabitants, reflected both the intensity of British rage against Roman occupation and the strategic calculation that complete destruction of Roman settlements and extermination of Roman colonists and their British collaborators might convince Rome that Britain was too costly to hold, potentially forcing an imperial withdrawal similar to Augustus's abandonment of Germany after the Teutoburg disaster. Boudicca's forces, estimated by Roman sources at enormous numbers that likely represent exaggerations, intended to magnify the subsequent victory, but nonetheless indicate that the uprising drew support from multiple tribes across southeastern Britain. First attacked Camulodunum, where the veteran colonists had made themselves particularly unpopular through their treatment of dispossessed Trinovantes, and where the Temple of Claudius symbolized both religious imposition and economic exploitation. The destruction of Camulodunum involved the systematic massacre of the Roman population, the torture and execution of prisoners in religious rituals that inverted Roman sacrificial practices, and the complete demolition of buildings, creating archaeological layers of burned destruction that remain visible in modern excavations and testify to the revolt's ferocity. The 9th Legion, marching south from its base in Lindum to relieve the besieged colony, was ambushed and largely destroyed, with only the legate and his cavalry escaping while the infantry were annihilated, demonstrating that British forces possessed both the numbers and the tactical capability to defeat Roman military units when circumstances favoured them. The destruction of Londinium and Verulamium followed similar patterns, as Boudicca's forces swept through the principal commercial and administrative centres of Roman Britain, systematically exterminating Romans and Britons who had cooperated with the occupation while seizing or destroying the physical infrastructure of Roman rule. Londinium, which had developed into the province's primary commercial hub despite lacking formal municipal status, proved indefensible, and Suetonius Paulinus, arriving ahead of his legions to assess the situation, evacuated the settlement before the British forces arrived, abandoning the civilian population who could not keep pace with the military column to certain death in a calculated decision that sacrificed thousands to preserve his army for a later counterattack. The archaeological evidence from Londinium reveals a destruction layer containing burned debris and human remains that testifies to the comprehensive nature of the sack, as British forces methodically destroyed every structure and killed every inhabitant they could find, creating a wasteland where a thriving commercial centre had existed days before. Verulamium, a municipium inhabited primarily by Romanized Britons who had adopted Roman culture and legal status, suffered similar destruction, revealing that the uprising targeted not only Roman colonists, but also British collaborators who had accepted integration into the imperial system, making the revolt as much a civil war between competing visions of Britain's future as a straightforward anti-colonial resistance movement. The casualty figures provided by Roman sources, claiming that 70,000 Romans and allied Britons died in the three cities, likely represent exaggerations intended to magnify the severity of the crisis and the magnitude of the subsequent Roman victory. But even accounting for propaganda, inflation, the numbers suggest that the uprising achieved its objective of eliminating Roman presence across large areas of southeastern Britain. The decisive confrontation between Boudicca's forces and Suetonius Paulinus's army occurred somewhere in the Midlands, at a location that remains unidentified despite centuries of speculation, where the Roman governor, having concentrated his available forces, including the 14th and 20th legions and auxiliary units, selected a battlefield that negated the British numerical advantage by restricting the frontage available for attack and providing his infantry with protected flanks. The battle, described in detail by Tacitus drawing on eyewitness accounts, demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of Roman infantry in pitched combat when terrain and circumstances allowed them to employ their tactical system effectively. As the legionaries disciplined formations, coordinated javelin volleys, and controlled close-quarters combat, systematically destroyed the British attack, despite facing forces that outnumbered them perhaps 10 to 1. The British forces, having brought their families to witness what they anticipated would be a climactic victory that would end Roman presence in Britain, found their retreat blocked by their own wagon train, transforming the battlefield into a killing ground where Roman soldiers methodically slaughtered not only warriors but women and children, with casualty figures claimed by Roman sources reaching 80,000 British dead against negligible Roman losses in numbers that, even if significantly inflated, indicate a massacre of extraordinary proportions. Boudicca's death shortly after the battle, whether by suicide through poison as Roman sources claim or through other causes, ended the uprising's organized phase and eliminated the charismatic leadership that had unified disparate tribes in common cause against Rome, allowing Paulinus to conduct systematic punitive operations against the rebel tribes through the following months, devastating their territories and reducing their populations through military action and the famine conditions created by destruction of food supplies and prevention of agricultural work during the campaign season. The aftermath of the Boudiccan revolt transformed Roman policy in Britain in ways that would shape the province's subsequent development, as imperial authorities recognized that the uprising had resulted from unnecessarily brutal exploitation and that sustainable control required a more sophisticated approach, balancing military deterrence with economic development, administrative reform that would give at least some British communities reason to accept Roman rule, the replacement of Catus Decianus with a new procurator, and the eventual recall of Suetonius Paulinus, whose continuation of harsh punitive measures threatened to perpetuate the cycle of resistance and repression, signaled Rome's recognition that military victory alone could not secure Britain without parallel efforts to create stable governance structures and economic systems that would benefit both Roman interests and at least portions of the ex-parents' British population. The new procurator, Julius Classicianus, himself of Gallic origin and thus possessing personal understanding of provincial perspectives within the empire, advocated for policies that would reconcile British communities to Roman rule through fair administration and economic opportunity, arguing that perpetual military occupation and brutal repression would prove both costly and ineffective in creating the stable, productive province that imperial authorities desired. The gradual shift toward more accommodating policies in the decades following the revolt, combined with systematic development of urban centers, encouragement of villa construction and agricultural investment, and integration of British elites into provincial administration through grants of citizenship and municipal office, represented lessons learned from the near disaster of 60 to 61 AD, demonstrating that successful imperialism required not merely military conquest, but construction of political and economic systems that gave subject populations stakes in the imperial order's maintenance. The campaigns in northern Britain and the conquest of the Brigantian territory during the 72nd AD extended Roman military control to the Tyne-Solway line and brought the empire into direct confrontation with the Caledonian tribes beyond the nascent northern frontier, creating security challenges that would shape Romano-British history for the next 3 centuries and ultimately prove impossible to resolve permanently. The collapse of Cartimandua's authority among the Brigantes, triggered by her divorce of her consort Venutius and marriage to his armor-bearer, precipitated a civil war that required Roman military intervention to rescue the client queen and created the pretext for direct annexation of the Brigantian territory, as successive governors concluded that a buffer state, torn by internal conflict, could not effectively serve Roman strategic interests, and that only direct military occupation could secure the northern approaches to Roman Britain. Quintus Petilius Cerealis, arriving as governor in 71 AD, fresh from commanding a legion during the suppression of the Batavian revolt in Germany, conducted aggressive campaigns that conquered the Brigantian heartland and pushed Roman authority northward to the line between the Tyne and Solway estuaries, establishing legionary fortresses at Eboracum to anchor the new frontier and constructing a network of auxiliary forts that controlled the Pennine passes and major communication routes through the northern uplands. The conquest of the Brigantes marked a qualitative shift in the Romano-British frontier, as the northern boundary of the province now directly confronted unconquered tribes beyond, rather than relying on client kingdoms to provide buffer zones, necessitating permanent military deployments that would tie down substantial forces and consume resources throughout the remaining centuries of Roman occupation. The governorship of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, from 77 to 83 or 84 AD, represented the high water mark of Roman military expansion in Britain, as this energetic and ambitious governor, whose biography written by his son-in-law Tacitus provides uniquely detailed information about his campaigns and policies, completed the conquest of Wales, invaded southern Scotland, and advanced Roman forces to the northern highlands before constructing a temporary frontier line across the Fourth Clyde Isthmus. Agricola's Welsh campaigns eliminated the last pockets of independence in the mountainous regions, capturing Anglesey for a second time and establishing permanent garrisons that suppressed the endemic raiding that had plagued the borderlands for decades, finally achieving the strategic objectives that had eluded his predecessors. The construction of auxiliary forts throughout Wales, connected by military roads that penetrated previously inaccessible valleys, created an occupation infrastructure that controlled the indigenous population, not through extermination, but through overwhelming military presence that made resistance futile, while simultaneously exposing the Welsh tribes to Roman economic and cultural influences that would gradually erode traditional social structures. The establishment of legionary fortresses at Deva and Isca to anchor the occupation of Wales and the northwestern approaches demonstrated Rome's commitment to permanent control of these recently pacified regions, as these massive military installations housed entire legions and served as manufacturing centers, supply depots, and administrative headquarters that projected Roman power throughout their respective regions. Agricola's Scottish campaigns, conducted annually from 79 to 83 or 84 AD, pushed Roman forces progressively northward through the lowlands and into the highlands, establishing temporary forts and supply bases that supported advancing columns while attempting to bring Caledonian tribes to decisive battle where Roman military superiority could be decisively demonstrated. The progressive nature of these campaigns, advancing further each summer before withdrawing to more secure positions for winter, reflected both the logistical challenges of operating far from established bases in hostile territory, with limited infrastructure, and the strategic calculation that permanent occupation of the highlands would require resources that Rome might not be willing to commit for territories whose economic value appeared marginal. The circumnavigation of Britain by Agricola's fleet, proving definitively that Britain was an island, and eliminating any remaining geographic mysteries about its extent, served propaganda purposes by demonstrating Roman mastery of the distant northwestern ocean, while simultaneously performing the practical function of supplying coastal bases that facilitated the army's northward advance, potentially intimidating coastal tribes through naval demonstrations of Roman power. The culminating battle at Mons Graupius in 83 or 84 AD, somewhere in northeastern Scotland at a location that remains unidentified, pitted Agricola's forces against a Caledonian confederation under the leadership of Calgacus, whose speech before the battle, as reported by Tacitus, included the famous observation that Romans create a desolation and call it peace, articulating a fundamental critique of imperial conquest that would resonate through subsequent centuries of anti-imperial thought. The Battle of Mons Graupius demonstrated once again the overwhelming superiority of Roman arms in conventional combat, as Agricola's auxiliary infantry and cavalry, fighting in the vanguard while legionary forces remained in reserve, defeated the Caledonian forces decisively, inflicting casualties that Roman sources numbered at 10,000 against minimal losses to their own forces, in ratios that suggest either gross exaggeration or a completely one-sided slaughter. The victory, however, proved strategically meaningless, as the surviving Caledonians simply dispersed into the highlands, where Roman forces could not effectively pursue them, and the apparent conquest of northern Scotland could not be consolidated without permanent garrisons that would have overstretched Roman military resources in Britain beyond sustainable limits. Agricola's recall shortly after the battle, whether representing routine rotation of provincial governors or reflecting imperial displeasure at his aggressive expansion, without authorization to permanently occupy the conquered territories, marked the end of Roman offensive operations in northern Britain, as subsequent governors abandoned the highland forts and withdrew to more defensible positions further south. The Fourth Clyde Line, where Agricola had constructed a barrier of forts connected by a military road, briefly served as the northern frontier, before this too was abandoned in favor of the Tyne-Solway Line, as Roman authorities concluded that the security benefits of forward positions in Scotland did not justify the military commitment required to maintain them against persistent pressure from unconquered tribes. The construction of Hadrian's Wall, beginning in 122 AD, represented a fundamental shift in Roman frontier policy in Britain, abandoning the concept of perpetual expansion in favor of a clearly demarcated permanent boundary that would separate the Roman province from the barbarian north through imposing physical infrastructure that both marked the limits of Roman authority and controlled movement across the frontier. The Emperor Hadrian, visiting Britain personally in 122 AD as part of his empire-wide inspection tours, ordered construction of a continuous stone barrier stretching 73 miles from Wallsend on the Tyne to Bowness-on-Solway, punctuated by mile castles at intervals of approximately 1 Roman mile, and turrets spaced between them, with major forts at strategic intervals, housing auxiliary garrisons that provided the military force necessary to control the barrier and respond to threats. The wall's construction, requiring perhaps 15,000 labourers working for 6 years to complete the original scheme, represented the most ambitious engineering project undertaken in Roman Britain and created a monument to imperial power, whose ruins remain visible across the north of England nearly 2 millennia after its construction, testimony to Roman engineering expertise and the resources that the empire could marshal for frontier defence. The barrier served multiple functions beyond simple military defence, controlling trade and movement across the frontier through designated crossing points where Roman authorities could monitor traffic, collect customs duties, and regulate contact between Roman and non-Roman populations, transforming the frontier from a permeable boundary to a controlled interface between civilization and barbarism, as Romans conceived these categories. The military installations along Hadrian's Wall created a permanent infrastructure that would shape northern British history for 3 centuries. As garrison communities of auxiliary soldiers drawn from across the empire established themselves in the frontier zone, intermarrying with local populations, developing civilian settlements adjacent to the forts, and creating a distinctive frontier society that blended Roman military culture with indigenous British traditions and the customs of auxiliary soldiers recruited from distant provinces. The forts housed specialized units, including cavalry, infantry, and mixed cohorts totaling perhaps 9,000 men at full strength, though actual garrison levels fluctuated based on military requirements elsewhere in the empire and the province's strategic priority relative to other frontiers. The soldiers' origins, documented in military records and inscriptions found at wall sites, reveal the cosmopolitan nature of Roman military service, as units recruited in Spain, Germany, the Balkans, North Africa, and even Syria found themselves stationed in northern Britain, bringing their native deities, customs, and languages to the remote northwestern frontier, while gradually acclimating to the challenging environmental conditions of northern England. The vici, or civilian settlements that developed outside the wall, forts housed merchants, craftsmen, family members of soldiers, and service providers who created small towns wholly dependent on military spending, but nonetheless exhibiting sophisticated material culture and economic specialization that integrated frontier communities into broader Romano-British economic networks. The brief occupation of southern Scotland during the reign of Antoninus Pius and the construction of the Antonine Wall across the Fourth Clyde Isthmus in the 142nd AD represented a temporary revival of forward frontier policy, before ultimate retrenchment to the Hadrianic line established the permanent northern limit of Roman Britain for the remaining centuries of imperial presence. The Antonine Wall, though shorter than Hadrian's Wall at only 37 miles, consisted initially of a turf rampart on stone foundations with associated forts and fortlets, creating a barrier system that enclosed the central Scottish lowlands within the province, while pushing the frontier northward by approximately 100 miles. The motivations for this expansion remain debated, potentially reflecting Antoninus Pius's desire for military prestige, despite his generally peaceful reign. Strategic calculations that the Fourth Clyde Line offered geographic advantages that made it more defensible than the Tyne-Solway position, or the accumulation of diplomatic and military pressures that made forward operations necessary to re-establish Roman prestige and authority in northern Britain, after decades of relatively static frontier policy. The occupation of southern Scotland proved short-lived. However, as the Antonine Wall was abandoned by the early 162nd and briefly reoccupied before final abandonment around 164 AD, with Roman forces withdrawing to Hadrian's Wall, which would serve as the definitive northern frontier for the remainder of Roman Britain's existence. The reasons for the abandonment of the Antonine frontier remain unclear, but likely combined military pressures from Caledonian tribes, manpower requirements for wars on the Danube frontier, and strategic reassessment, suggesting that the costs of maintaining advanced positions in Scotland exceeded the security benefits they provided. The development of urban centres throughout Roman Britain during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD transformed the landscape and created new settlement patterns that concentrated population, economic activity, and political authority in ways that permanently altered British society, even in regions that reverted to rural character after Rome's withdrawal. Londinium, having recovered from its destruction during the Boudiccan revolt, emerged as the province's capital and commercial hub, its position at the lowest bridging point on the Thames, making it the natural nexus for trade routes, connecting the interior with continental markets, while its role as provincial capital brought imperial officials, military logistics operations, and the legal apparatus of Roman government to create a cosmopolitan city that by the 2nd century may have housed 30,000 inhabitants. The city's infrastructure included a massive basilica serving as government headquarters and commercial centre, public baths demonstrating Roman material culture and social customs, an amphitheatre for entertainment, extensive waterfront facilities for river commerce, and defensive walls constructed after a 2nd century fire that enclosed an area of approximately 330 acres. The material evidence from Londinium reveals sophisticated commercial activity, with imported goods from across the empire, including Mediterranean wine and olive oil, Spanish copper and lead, German glassware, and Gallic pottery, demonstrating that Roman Britain was integrated into empire-wide trade networks that allowed even frontier provinces access to luxury goods and specialized products from distant regions. The coloniae established at Camulodunum, Glevum, Lindum, and Eboracum as settlements for veteran legionaries created communities of Roman citizens possessing full legal rights and serving as anchors of Roman culture in the province, intended to provide both military reserves available for emergencies and examples of properly Roman urban life that would encourage indigenous elites to adopt Roman customs and values. The veteran colonies, though never large by Mediterranean standards, with populations probably numbered in thousands rather than tens of thousands, possessed urban infrastructure including forums, temples, public baths, and defensive circuits that marked them as distinctively Roman settlements, rather than indigenous towns adopting Roman forms. The economic impact of these colonies on surrounding territories proved substantial, as veteran settlers required food supplies, manufactured goods, and services that stimulated local production, while their purchasing power, derived from military pensions and accumulated service pay, injected capital into regional economies. The social impact may have exceeded the economic, however, as the presence of communities of Roman citizens possessing legal privileges unavailable to most provincial inhabitants created visible demonstrations of the advantages that Roman citizenship conferred, encouraging ambitious Britons to pursue the paths towards citizenship through military service, municipal office, or imperial favour. The emergence of tribal capitals and municipal towns throughout the province created an urban hierarchy beneath the coloniae that gave Romano-British society institutional framework for local government, and provided indigenous elites, with opportunities for political participation and social distinction within the Roman imperial system. The civitates, or tribal capitals, established at locations often related to pre-Roman centers of tribal authority, served as administrative headquarters for their respective regions, housing local government institutions that managed civic affairs under Roman oversight, while preserving nominal continuity with pre-conquest political structures by organizing provincial administration around redefined tribal territories. Venta Icenorum for the Iceni, Caleva Atrebatum for the Atrebates, Corinium Dobanorum for the Dobuni, and similar centers throughout lowland, Britain received civic improvements, including forums for public assembly and commerce, basilicas for administrative and judicial functions, public baths demonstrating Roman leisure culture, temples integrating Roman and native religious traditions, and defensive walls, providing both security and symbolic demarcation of urban space from surrounding countryside. The gradual transformation of these administrative centers into true cities with substantial permanent populations required decades of development as local elites invested in urban properties, merchants established permanent commercial operations, and craftsmen concentrated in urban locations where clientele and opportunities justified abandoning dispersed rural settlement patterns. The construction of villas throughout the countryside, particularly in the prosperous agricultural regions of the southeast, Cotswolds, and other favored locations, created a distinctive Romano-British aristocratic material culture that combined Roman architectural forms and artistic traditions with adaptation to British environmental conditions and continued connection to indigenous social hierarchies. The villa estates, ranging from modest farmhouses with minimal Roman features to elaborate palace-like complexes with dozens of rooms, sophisticated mosaic floors, hypercaust heating systems, and extensive agricultural facilities, represented investment in permanent rural infrastructure by landowners who possessed both the capital for substantial construction projects and confidence in long-term stability that justified such investment. The development of villa culture accelerated during the 2nd century as Romano-British society achieved prosperity and political stability, with the most elaborate establishments dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries, demonstrating that even during periods of imperial crisis, Britain's rural elite continued accumulating wealth and investing in architectural display that advertised their status through adoption of Roman aristocratic lifestyle markers. The economic basis of villa wealth varied, with some estates primarily producing grain for urban markets or military supply, others concentrating on livestock production, particularly sheep raising for wool, and many maintaining diversified agricultural operations that reduced risk through multiple income sources while achieving self-sufficiency in basic necessities. The mosaic floors, wall paintings, bath suites, and architectural elaboration found in wealthy villas demonstrated sophisticated artistic production and cultural connections, linking Romano-British elites to broader Mediterranean artistic traditions, while simultaneously developing distinctive regional styles that combined Roman iconographic programs with local preferences and Celtic artistic motifs. The mosaics, produced by workshops that moved between commissions throughout southern Britain, displayed geometric patterns, mythological scenes drawn from Greco-Roman literature, and increasingly during the 4th century, Christian imagery that reflected religious transformation affecting provincial elite culture. The survival of these mosaics into modern times, often discovered during agricultural operations or construction projects, provides rare opportunities to examine Romano-British artistic culture and trace connections between specific workshops and their patrons, revealing patronage networks and cultural pretensions of provincial aristocrats who commissioned expensive decorative programs for rooms that hosted social gatherings where mosaics served as conversation pieces, demonstrating the patron's education, wealth, and connection to classical culture. The technical expertise required to design and execute elaborate mosaic programs, particularly those depicting complex mythological narratives or sophisticated geometric patterns, indicates that Romano-British artistic production achieved high standards. and suggests that wealthy patrons were willing to invest substantial resources in artistic patronage that brought no direct economic return, but provided intangible benefits of social distinction and cultural prestige. The religious transformation of Roman Britain during the imperial period involved complex interactions between traditional British Celtic practices, Roman state religion, including the imperial cult, mystery cults imported from Eastern Mediterranean regions, and ultimately, Christianity, creating a diverse religious landscape where multiple systems coexisted, sometimes in tension, but more often in syncretism, that allowed individuals to participate in different religious contexts for different purposes. The Romano-Celtic temples, found throughout Britain, displaying architectural forms that blended Celtic square shrine designs with Roman construction techniques and classical decorative elements, housed deities who might bear Roman names while possessing attributes and receiving worship forms derived from pre-Roman British tradition, demonstrating the creative fusion that characterized much provincial religious practice. Sulis Minerva at Bath exemplified this syncretism, as the pre-Roman hot spring sanctuary associated with a Celtic healing goddess became under Roman rule, an elaborate temple complex where the deity received a hybrid Roman-British name and presided over baths and religious facilities that combined Roman bathing culture with therapeutic pilgrimage traditions. The elaborate temple complex at Bath, with its classical-style temple overlooking sophisticated bathing facilities that exploited the natural hot springs, attracted visitors from throughout Britain and beyond, generating an economy of pilgrimage that included accommodation for visitors, production of religious offerings, and curse tablets that petitioners deposited in the sacred spring, and healing services provided by religious personnel who managed the sanctuary. The mystery cults, particularly Mithraism, which achieved significant popularity among military personnel and merchants throughout the empire, established themselves in Britain during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, creating religious communities bound by initiation rites, sacred knowledge restricted to initiates, and ritual practices that offered alternatives to the public civic religion of traditional Roman cult. The Mithraea, or temples of Mithras, discovered at military sites along Hadrian's Wall and at Londinium, demonstrate the cult's appeal to soldiers and merchants, offering religious experiences emphasizing personal salvation and moral behavior within exclusive communities defined by shared esoteric knowledge, rather than the civic-focused public rituals characteristic of traditional Roman religion. The Londinium Mithraeum, discovered during post-war reconstruction in the 1952, preserved remarkable sculptural evidence, including representations of the god slaying the cosmic bull, demonstrating sophisticated religious art production in Roman Britain and the willingness of wealthy patrons to invest in constructing temples for religions lacking official state support. The exclusion of women from Mithraic worship, the secretive nature of its rituals, and its emphasis on moral dualism and cosmic struggle between light and darkness gave the cult distinctive character, separating its initiates from broader society, while its structured hierarchy of 7 initiation grades provided members with clear progression through levels of religious knowledge and status that paralleled military and social hierarchies in the outside world. The arrival of Christianity in Britain and its gradual spread through provincial society during the 3rd and 4th centuries introduced religious transformation that would have profound long-term implications for British history. Though during the Roman period, Christianity remained one option among many in a diverse religious marketplace, and never achieved the cultural dominance it would gain in the medieval period. The earliest evidence for Christianity in Britain remains ambiguous, with the martyrdom of Saint Alban during 3rd century persecutions, providing the most prominent early Christian tradition, though its historical details remain uncertain, while archaeological evidence for Christian practice before the 4th century proves elusive and difficult to distinguish from other religious activity. The legalization of Christianity under Constantine in 313 AD and its subsequent promotion as the favored religion of the imperial house transformed the religion's prospects, encouraging open practice and enabling construction of church buildings. While Christian emperors directed resources toward Christian institutions and offered career advantages to Christian officials, creating incentives for conversion, particularly among ambitious individuals seeking advancement in imperial service. The British bishops who attended the Council of Arles in 314 AD and the Council of Rimini in 359 AD demonstrated that organized Christian communities with episcopal leadership existed in major provincial centers, though the extent of Christianization beyond urban elites remains debatable, with rural areas likely maintaining traditional religious practices alongside or in place of Christian observance well into the late Roman period. The economic systems that developed in Roman Britain created prosperity based on agricultural production, mineral extraction, manufacturing, and trade that integrated the province into empire-wide economic networks while supporting urban populations, military garrisons, and villa-dwelling aristocrats in standards of living that represented significant improvement over pre-Roman conditions, at least for those who benefited from the new economic opportunities. Agricultural production, always the foundation of pre-industrial economies, intensified under Roman rule as new crops, including better wheat varieties, vegetables like carrots and onions, fruits such as cherries and mulberries, and herbs entered cultivation, while improved iron tools, more sophisticated agricultural techniques, and market opportunities created by urban demand encouraged increased productivity that supported larger non-agricultural populations. The villa estates, organizing agricultural production through slave labor and tenant farming arrangements, produced surpluses for urban markets and military supply, with grain from southeastern Britain potentially reaching continental markets through the state's taxation-in-kind system that acquired food supplies for military use and redistributed them throughout the empire. The growth of sheep raising for wool production during the late Roman period created export industries that brought external wealth into the province, with British woolen products achieving reputation for quality that made them marketable luxuries in other provinces, demonstrating that Roman Britain was not merely a resource-extracting dependency, but developed specialized manufacturing that participated in interregional trade. The mining operations that extracted lead, silver, tin, copper, iron, and gold from British deposits represented significant economic activity, employing thousands of workers and generating revenues for both imperial authorities, who controlled major mining operations, and private contractors who leased mining rights or operated smaller deposits. The lead mines of the Mendips and Derbyshire, exploited from the early conquest period, as evidenced by lead ingots bearing early imperial stamps, produced ore that was processed on site to extract silver content, while the lead itself found uses in water pipes, roofing, coffins, and curse tablets, creating diverse markets for the metal. The silver extracted from lead ore, though present only in small percentages, proved valuable enough to justify the processing costs and represented important revenue source for imperial authorities who monopolized precious metal production. The tin deposits of Cornwall, exploited since prehistoric times and famous in the ancient world, continued production under Roman administration, supplying tin for bronze production both in Britain and potentially for continental markets, where demand for bronze remained substantial despite iron's dominance for most utilitarian purposes. The iron deposits scattered throughout Britain supported local smithing operations, producing everything from agricultural tools and construction materials to military equipment and household items, creating manufacturing centers that employed specialized craftsmen and supported communities dependent on metallurgical industries. The pottery industries that developed in specific regions possessing suitable clay deposits and fuel supplies created specialized manufacturing that supplied markets throughout Britain and occasionally achieved sufficient scale and quality to export products to military sites on the continental frontier, demonstrating Romano-British manufacturing could compete in wider markets when transportation costs permitted. The Nenny Valley industry in the East Midlands, producing colour-coated wares decorated with painted designs, established markets throughout eastern Britain and achieved recognition for quality that made its products preferable to alternatives, even when local pottery was available. The Alice Holt and Farnham industries in southeastern England produced grey wares for everyday domestic use, manufacturing at sufficient scale to supply urban markets in Londinium and southeastern settlements, while maintaining quality standards that ensured their products remained competitive with alternatives. The specialised production of Samian-style wares at Colchester represented ambitious attempts to manufacture in Britain pottery forms previously imported from Gaul, demonstrating both technical sophistication of Romano-British potters and market demand for tablewares, displaying classical forms and decoration that marked their users as participants in Roman material culture, rather than maintaining distinctively British ceramic traditions. The road network, constructed primarily for military purposes, transformed economic geography by dramatically reducing transportation costs between regions, enabling market integration that allowed specialized regional production to reach distant consumers while facilitating administrative control and military mobility throughout the province. The major arterial roads radiating from Londinium to provincial destinations created primary transportation corridors, supplemented by secondary routes that connected regional centers and provided access to more remote areas, producing a comprehensive infrastructure that survived Rome's departure to influence British settlement patterns and economic geography for subsequent centuries. The engineering quality of Roman road construction, with foundations of large stones overlaid with smaller material and surface layers of gravel, or occasionally stone paving, created all-weather routes, passable by wheeled vehicles year-round, revolutionary improvement over pre-Roman trackways that became impassable during wet conditions or required river crossings, dependent on fords or ferries vulnerable to flooding. The routes chosen for Roman roads often followed natural corridors through hills or sought river crossings at optimal locations, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of topography and engineering principles, while creating routes whose logic remained valid for subsequent road builders, who often followed Roman alignments when constructing medieval and modern road systems. The military occupation of Britain required sustained deployment of substantial forces throughout the Roman period, with garrison levels fluctuating between approximately 40,000 and 60,000 troops, depending on frontier pressures, imperial military requirements in other regions, and provincial strategic importance relative to competing priorities. The three legions initially stationed in Britain, the 2nd Augusta at Caerleon in Wales, the 20th Valeria Victrix at Chester in northwestern England, and the 6th Victrix at York in northern England, provided heavy infantry corps of the garrison, each legion theoretically fielding 5,300 heavily armoured soldiers, organised into cohorts and centuries with elaborate command structures, supporting staff, and attached specialists. The auxiliary forces, recruited from non-citizen populations throughout the empire and eventually including British recruits, provided perhaps 35,000 additional troops organised into cohorts of infantry or cavalry, alae, and mixed units combining both arms. These forces performing garrison duties at small forts throughout the province, but particularly concentrated along the northern frontier and in Wales, where security requirements remained acute. The military presence created enormous demand for supplies including food, equipment, animals, construction materials, and endless minor items required by large organizations. This demand stimulating local production, while military pay circulated through frontier economies, supporting civilian communities entirely dependent on military spending. The frontier zone along Hadrian's Wall developed distinctive character, as frontier regions often do, creating hybrid society where military discipline and Roman administrative structures coexisted with accommodations to local conditions and cultures, where soldiers born in distant provinces married British women and raised children who were British by upbringing, though technically non-citizens, until their father's military service entitled them to citizenship, and where the boundary between Roman and non-Roman became blurred through daily interactions, trade, intermarriage, and military recruitment from supposedly barbarian populations beyond the wall. The inscriptions and archaeological evidence from wall sites reveal soldiers worshipping Syrian deities alongside Roman gods and Celtic spirits, demonstrating religious syncretism that characterized frontier regions where multiple cultures interacted intensively, while the presence of merchants from throughout the empire craftsmen practicing Mediterranean trades in northern British settings, and wives and families creating permanent civilian settlements transformed the military frontier into a complex multicultural zone rather than simply a barrier separating Romans from barbarians. The interactions with peoples beyond the wall, managed through diplomacy, subsidy payments, trade relationships, and occasional military expeditions, created buffer zones where tribes remained nominally independent while accepting Roman influence and receiving payments that bound their leaders' interests to maintaining peace. This system allowing Roman authorities to extend influence beyond the formal frontier without assuming costs of direct occupation. The provincial government administered Britain through a hierarchy of officials responsible to the emperor, with the governor combining military command of provincial forces with civilian administrative authority, while a separate financial official controlled taxation and imperial property, creating checks and balances that theoretically prevented provincial governors from accumulating excessive power that might enable rebellion. The governor, normally a senator of consular rank, who had previously held legionary commands and provincial governorships of lesser importance, served multi-year terms that provided continuity, while regular rotation prevented individuals from establishing permanent local power bases that might threaten imperial authority. The staff supporting the governor included military officers, commanding the legions and responsible for specific regions, administrative officials managing legal affairs, taxation, records, and correspondence, and numerous clerks and functionaries whose routine work maintained the bureaucratic machinery, enabling tax collection, legal proceedings, road maintenance, census operations, and countless other governmental functions that constituted Roman administration. The financial procurator, normally of equestrian rank and appointed separately from the governor to ensure independent reporting to the emperor, managed taxation, imperial estates, mining operations, and financial affairs generally, his staff collecting taxes in kind and coinage, managing accounts, conducting censuses for tax assessment purposes, and transmitting revenues to the imperial treasury, while maintaining records that allowed central authorities to monitor provincial financial health. The late Roman period in Britain, spanning roughly the mid-3rd through early 5th centuries, witnessed both continued prosperity, evidenced by elaborate villa construction and wealthy urban life, and simultaneously increasing military and political instability that would ultimately contribute to the province's separation from Maiden, the empire. The 3rd century imperial crisis affected Britain less dramatically than regions exposed to Persian attacks or Germanic invasions, but the usurpations and civil wars that repeatedly divided the empire created political instability, while military units withdrawn to support competing emperors weakened Britain's defences and encouraged raiding from unconquered peoples beyond the frontiers. The Gallic Empire's separation from imperial control between 260 and 274 AD brought Britain under the authority of emperors ruling from Gaul rather than Rome or the East, demonstrating that peripheral provinces could be detached from central authority when imperial unity collapsed, while revealing Britain's tendency to align with Western rather than Eastern power centres during periods of imperial division. The usurpation of Carausius in 286 or 287 AD, when the commander of the British fleet proclaimed himself emperor and successfully maintained independent rule in Britain for 7 years, despite attempts by legitimate emperors to recover the province, demonstrated both Britain's defensibility when controlled by competent military leaders with naval forces, protecting the Channel crossings, and the province's economic viability as an independent political entity capable of supporting governmental structures and military forces without imperial subsidies. The recovery of Britain by Constantius Chlorus in 296 AD restored imperial control, but inaugurated a period of administrative reorganization, as the Diocletianic reforms divided provinces into smaller units with civil and military authorities separated, reducing opportunities for provincial governors to accumulate excessive power while creating more elaborate bureaucratic structures that increased governmental costs and administrative complexity. Britain was divided into multiple smaller provinces, probably initially 4, before later subdivision into 5, each with its own governor responsible for civilian administration, while military command was separated under different officers responsible to the imperial hierarchy. This multiplication of officials, theoretically improving control, while creating additional administrative layers and associated costs. The reconstruction of frontier defences, the establishment of Saxon shore forts along the southeastern and eastern coasts to counter seaborne raiding, and the continued maintenance of urban defences and road networks demonstrated imperial investment in Britain's security and infrastructure, suggesting that despite political instability, the province retained sufficient economic and strategic value to justify continued expenditure on its defence. The 4th century witnessed both recovery and flourishing of Romano-British civilization, evidenced by elaborate villa construction, prosperous urban life, sophisticated artistic production, and apparent peace that allowed civilian life to proceed without constant military emergencies, creating what some historians have characterized as a golden age of Roman Britain when the province achieved its highest development and greatest prosperity. The religious transformation accompanying Christianity's establishment as the imperial religion affected Britain as it did other provinces, with Christian churches constructed in urban centres, Christian symbols appearing in artistic production, and Christian officials gradually replacing pagans in governmental positions as the 4th century progressed, and Christian emperors directed patronage preferentially toward co-religionists. The presence of British bishops at church councils, the construction of church buildings evidenced by archaeological discoveries, and the appearance of Christian symbols in mosaics, silverware, and other material evidence demonstrates that Christianity penetrated provincial elite culture and established institutional presence in major urban centres, though the extent of conversion among rural populations and lower social classes remains uncertain, with traditional religious practices likely continuing alongside or beneath official Christianity. The British Church developed distinctive traditions that would later complicate its relationship with continental Christianity, particularly regarding Easter date calculations and organizational structures. But during the 4th century, these differences remained minor, and British Christianity appeared fully integrated into the empire-wide church, emerging from persecution to imperial favor. The production of Christian silver hoards, including the Mildenhall treasure and Water Newton hoard, demonstrates wealthy patrons investing in religious patronage through commission of liturgical vessels decorated with Christian imagery, evidence that Christianity had penetrated sufficiently into provincial elite culture that wealthy families were commissioning expensive religious art rather than merely participating in public religious observances. The political and military crises of the late 4th century, particularly the barbarian conspiracy of 367 AD, when coordinated attacks by Picts, Scots, and Saxons breached Roman defences and devastated regions of the province before imperial armies restored order, demonstrated increasing pressure on Britain's frontiers and the vulnerability of the province when regular military forces were withdrawn or when multiple enemies coordinated attacks overwhelming local defences. The Emperor Theodosius's recovery operations and defensive reorganizations attempted to restore security, but the repeated withdrawals of British garrison units to support usurpers or defend the continent against Germanic invasions progressively weakened the province's military capacity, while creating dependencies on external military support that would prove fatal when such support ceased. The usurpations of Magnus Maximus in 383 AD and Constantine III in 407 AD, both British-based commanders who withdrew troops from the province to pursue imperial ambitions on the continent, depleted military forces while demonstrating continued capacity of British armies to intervene in imperial politics, though both usurpations ultimately failed and left Britain more vulnerable than before. The successful establishment of Magnus Maximus for several years and Constantine III's initial military successes created temporary optimism that British-based emperors might establish lasting dynasties, but both ultimately faced defeat and execution, while the troops they had withdrawn from Britain never returned, leaving the province increasingly reliant on local defense forces rather than professional Roman military units. The final years of Roman Britain remain obscure, with written sources nearly silent about events after 410 AD when the Emperor Honorius allegedly replied to appeals from British civitates that they should look to their own defence. This response, often interpreted as marking the official end of Roman Britain, though recent scholarship questions whether the famous letter actually concerned Britain or referred to cities in Italy. The progressive breakdown of Roman administration, the cessation of coinage circulation, suggesting economic collapse, and the end of monetized taxation systems, the abandonment of villas, evidencing disruption of villa-based agricultural systems, and the apparent depopulation or radical transformation of towns, all indicate profound crisis affecting Romano-British society in the early 5th century. Though whether these changes resulted from military conquest, economic collapse, political disintegration, or some combination, remains debated. The Saxon settlements beginning during this period, initially perhaps as invited foederati, employed to defend against other raiders, but eventually establishing independent territories, initiated the cultural transformation that would create Anglo-Saxon England, though British political entities survived in Western regions for centuries, maintaining some continuity with Roman-era institutions and identities. The British resistance to Saxon expansion, commemorated in later tradition, and possibly reflected in historical figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, whose resistance to Saxon advance achieved temporary success, demonstrated that Romano-British society did not simply collapse, but attempted to maintain civilized life and political organization in deteriorating circumstances, though ultimately most of lowland Britain came under Saxon control, while British culture survived primarily in Wales, Cornwall, and regions beyond Hadrian's Wall. The legacy of Roman Britain extended far beyond the imperial period through linguistic influences on British languages, particularly the introduction of Latin-derived vocabulary into Welsh and Cornish. Urban sites, whose locations remained significant even when the Roman settlements were abandoned, with medieval towns often reoccupying Roman sites or arising at crossroads on Roman roads. The impact of Christianity, which despite early medieval struggles, ultimately defined British religious culture, and archaeological remains that continue to reveal new information about Romano-British society while providing physical connection to this distant but formative period. The survival of Latin as the language of learning, government, and ecclesiastical affairs in medieval Britain, despite the Germanic language's dominance in everyday life, created linguistic continuity connecting medieval British culture to its Roman roots, while the Christian Church's organization and learning preserved Roman intellectual traditions through the medieval period, even as political structures collapsed. The material legacy survives in the roads, whose courses remain visible in modern landscapes and often underlie contemporary transportation routes. The stone buildings, whose ruins testify to construction, sophistication, and ambition. The countless artifacts recovered through centuries of archaeological investigation that reveal intimate details of daily life, economic systems, artistic traditions, and social structures. And the place names, preserving Roman terminology, or commemorating Roman sites in linguistic forms that evolved through centuries of language change. The scholarly investigation of Roman Britain, beginning with antiquarian efforts in the Renaissance and early modern periods, progressing through increasingly systematic archaeological excavation during the 19th and 20th centuries, and continuing through contemporary multidisciplinary research, employing scientific analytical techniques alongside traditional excavation, has progressively revealed the complexity and sophistication of Romano-British society, demonstrating that this distant northwestern province achieved levels of economic development, cultural sophistication, and social complexity that rivaled more famous regions, while developing distinctive characteristics that emerged from its unique position at the intersection of Mediterranean civilization and indigenous British traditions, creating a Romano-British culture that was neither simply Roman nor purely British, but rather a creative synthesis that would influence British historical development for subsequent millennia.